tonight, the air carries the faint breath of wood smoke and rain. The last light of October fades over the countryside, and the wind stirs in quiet, restless turns along the hedgerows. Somewhere a door closes with a hollow thud, and the sound settles into the stillness that follows dusk. The hour is not yet late, but the world already feels different, drawn thin, as though the night waits for something to begin. If you are listening from far away, wherever you may be, take a moment to settle in. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders. Find the stillness in the room around you, the kind that belongs to this time of year when light grows scarce and every sound carries a little farther. Breathe in. Let the air move slow. Listen. Somewhere outside your own window, leaves scrape faintly against the ground, whispering that old reminder that another Halloween has come again. The year is somewhere in the 1800s. No particular one, for the customs of these nights change little from decade to decade. Across the fields and valleys of Britain, Ireland, and the small corners of Europe where the old ways still breathe, people draw their curtains and light their candles. The modern world has begun to hum beyond them. Railways, telegraphs, cities waking under gaslight. But here in the countryside, the hour belongs to memory. It is All Hallows Eve, when the veil between living and dead is said to thin, and old faiths stir in quiet defiance of the century's reason. The road that winds through the village is narrow and uneven. Hooves have worn it smooth in some places and jagged in others, where the rain has carved shallow gullies. A thin mist lies close to the ground, making the lantern light from cottages blur into small pools that drift in and out of sight. Turnip lamps still burn in most windows, their hollow faces uneven, cut by hands that know more about soil than art. Their light is unsteady but alive, glowing with the kind of warmth that comes from simple intention rather than perfection. A boy passes down the lane with a bundle of sticks on his shoulder. His boots leave wet marks in the dirt, and his breath rises faintly in the chill. He moves quickly, not because he is frightened, but because everyone in the village knows that the hours after sunset are not meant for lingering. Even the animals seem to know. The dogs bark once, then grow quiet. The horses in the stables shift their weight and snort softly, uneasy for reasons no one bothers to explain. The night has its own language, and those who live close to the land have learned to listen. In one cottage near the edge of the wood, a woman stirs the fire until the smoke curls thick and sweet from the peat. The walls of her home are low and whitewashed, built from rough stone and patched with the same care that keeps her alive each season. She moves slowly, steady from years of repetition. A sprig of rowan hangs above the door. A bowl of water sits on the windowsill, its surface still except when the draught brushes past. The sound of the wind against the thatch is rhythmic, soft as breath. These things she keeps not from superstition, as she would say, but from habit. Habit born from mothers and grandmothers who lived through winters long before the railway came near. The room smells of smoke and dried herbs. Bundles of thyme and sage hang from the rafters, and an old iron kettle hums quietly where it rests above the coals. Her cat sleeps near the hearth, one ear twitching each time the fire pops. On the table, a candle burns low beside a plate of bread and honey. No one eats from that plate. It waits for visitors who will never knock. The woman glances toward it now and then, not out of fear, but acknowledgement. It is simply what is done. Outside, the night grows colder. The trees along the edge of the wood creak and sway, their bare limbs scraping faintly together. The sound travels across the fields like slow speech. Somewhere, a barn door clatters loose against its hinge, and the echo rolls over the valley before fading into the mist. The air carries the scent of wet leaves and earth, the kind that clings to boots and coats. Farther down the lane, a small group of children walk in pairs, clutching small lanterns and bits of bread wrapped in cloth. Their whispers rise and fall like a soft chant. They leave offerings at doorsteps, crumbs, salt, bits of herb, small gestures for the wandering souls said to pass through the village tonight. No one expects to see these souls, but they act as though they might. Windows are shut tightly, mirrors covered, and fires tended with care. The old priest says it is nonsense, the remnants of pagan error. But even he will not travel the lanes after dark on this night. Tradition holds too much weight to be undone by disbelief alone. Beneath the cross, the old faiths sleep lightly. A church bell tolls in the distance, its sound thick in the fog. The note carries long and slow, marking the arrival of evening mass, but few attend. Most families stay home, gathering near their hearths with stories and songs that would not suit the altar. This night belongs to something older than any sermon, something woven through centuries of weather and want. The woman near the wood adjusts her shawl and sits down beside the fire. Her hands, strong but worn, turn slowly over a bundle of dried yarrow tied with red thread. She untangles it with careful fingers, separating the stems, laying them across a small cloth. Each one, she knows, carries a purpose. Protection for the threshold, healing for the sick, luck for the coming year. She will not call it magic, but she will not call it ordinary either. The line between such things blurs easily when the night leans close. The firelight flickers along the walls, tracing shadows that sway like silent figures. She watches them move and remembers what her mother told her, that shadows have patience, and that on Halloween they walk where they please. She does not challenge them. Instead, she speaks softly to the air, a habit of courtesy that has kept her house safe for many years. Across the valley, another hearth burns in a larger home. There, the candles are made of beeswax and the table is set with silver. The people within speak of spirits too, but in another tone entirely. They call it curiosity, a fashionable pastime from the city. They gather around a table with hands linked, waiting for knocks and whispers from the unseen. The same world, but different names for what they seek. In towns and cities, the age of reason has given way to a new fascination. Mediums hold seances in gaslit parlours. Gentlemen record the tapping of unseen hands, and ladies faint softly at the scent of phantom perfume. The newspapers mock them, yet print every word. Science watches with interest, as though the afterlife might be measured by clockwork. But far from the city, the old beliefs never left, and no one needs a séance to feel that the dead are near. The woman by the wood glances once more at the bowl of water on her sill. Its surface trembles faintly, though the air is still. She feels it in her bones before she sees it. The subtle change that comes each year when the night deepens and the world feels thinner. She lifts her eyes toward the window, but sees only her own reflection, faint and uncertain against the dark beyond. She knows better than to look too long. There are rules to these things. The cat stirs, lifting its head, ears pricked. The fire pops once, loud in the quiet. The woman reaches for another log, placing it gently on the coals, and the flames leap, spreading warmth through the small room. The shadows pull back. She exhales slowly, almost smiling. The old ways, she thinks, have not died. They only wait for nights like this to breathe again. Beyond her cottage, the village settles into silence. The mist thickens, swallowing sound until only the steady crackle of distant fires remains. Somewhere an owl calls, and the note hangs in the air, deep and hollow. The lanes are empty now. The children are home. Every window glows faintly, and above them the moon climbs through a ragged veil of cloud. In one house, an old man sits with a cup of cider, watching the candle flame tremble in the draught. He remembers his mother telling him stories of witches who danced in the fields when the crops were gathered, and of spirits who followed them home, seeking warmth. He laughs quietly at the thought, but he still sets a crust of bread near the door before going to bed. Some habits are stronger than reason. In another, a girl stares into a basin of water, hoping to see the face of her future husband. Her friends giggle beside her, their whispers breaking into nervous laughter when the candlelight shifts. The water shows nothing but ripples, yet each of them insists they felt a presence. Perhaps they did. Perhaps they only wanted to. Either way, the game belongs to the night, and it will not be played again until next year. The hours move gently toward midnight. The sound of the church bell drifts once more across the fields, marking the passage of time in slow, measured notes. In the cottages and the manors alike, candles burn lower and talk quiets into murmurs. The air feels heavy, but not hostile, just full, as if carrying more than one world at once. Far out beyond the village, the wind gathers over the moors. It moves in long, unbroken waves, bending the grass and whispering through the heather. Old stones stand there, half buried, their shapes softened by centuries of rain. No one tends them now, but on nights like this, people remember. They say the stones were once markers for the dead, or for the gods before the cross. Either way, they still hold something. When the moonlight touches them, it gleams faintly, like breath on glass. In the woman's cottage, the fire burns low, but steady. She sits still, listening to the faint stir of the wind through the cracks in the door. Her eyes half close, not from sleep, but from familiarity. She knows this hour well. The line between night and morning feels thinner than the air itself, and if one listens closely, it almost seems the earth hums beneath the silence. She does not move. She lets it pass through her like weather. The sound of the world narrows until only the pulse of the fire and the faint sigh of wind remain. Somewhere outside, an animal moves, a fox maybe, or something smaller, but it stays to the shadows, careful and unseen. The woman stirs the coals one last time, and the embers flare red, steady and sure. She glances toward the window, not to see, but to acknowledge, and whispers softly, "All is well." The night answers with nothing but stillness, and so the hours continue, each breath of wind carrying memory, each flicker of flame tracing the fragile thread that binds the living to what came before. It is the 1800s, but on Halloween night, time does not matter. Only the quiet persistence of belief, the kind that survives reason, that hums in the bones, that watches from the edge of light. The woman turns her gaze back to the fire, and outside, the mist drifts lower over the fields, gathering around the stones. The air holds steady, as though waiting for something older than fear, older than faith, to stir again. The fire had dimmed to a low amber glow. The woman sat without moving, her shawl drawn close around her shoulders, the rhythm of her breath matching the faint hiss of the coals. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. The trees near the edge of the wood bent under the weight of the wind, their limbs creaking softly, the sound blending with the slow pulse of the night. It was late now, though no clock marked the hour. She could tell by the quiet. Even the animals had stopped moving. Only the earth itself seemed awake. In the village below, Every cottage held its own version of the same silence. Smoke curled from the chimneys in thin fading trails, and the faint glow of lanterns marked where life still stirred. These people were not godless, though the priest would say otherwise. They attended church when the weather was fair and the crops forgiving. They nodded at sermons, bowed heads for blessings, and yet beneath the wooden pews, beneath the carved crucifix that watched from the altar, something older persisted. It breathed quietly, waiting for nights like this one. The old faith had not vanished. It had only learned to wear new clothes. The prayers changed their words, but not their meaning. The names of the saints replaced the names of spirits, but the gestures remained the same. When the people crossed themselves, they were still drawing symbols of protection in the air. When they lit candles for the dead, they were still feeding the flame that carried messages to the unseen. The church bell tolled, but in the fields and the hearths of the poor, other bells rang, quieter ones, made from iron and intention. Generations had learned to keep both faiths alive without conflict. On Sundays, the priest's Latin filled the air, sharp and proper, echoing through the cold stone nave. On the other days, the same people whispered charms over boiling water, buried nails under thresholds to ward off sickness, and left milk on windowsills for unseen guests. They did not see these acts as rebellion. They were insurance, small offerings to both heaven and earth, so that neither side felt forgotten. The woman by the wood had been raised on such balance. Her grandmother taught her the Psalms by heart, and also how to read the smoke from the fire. When she was a girl, she had gone to confession after a long winter illness and admitted to saying a charm over her brother's bed to drive the fever out. The priest had frowned, told her to say 10 Hail Marys, and to leave healing to God. She had said them dutifully, then gone home and placed a silver coin under her brother's pillow. By morning, the fever broke. No one spoke of it again, but from then on, she knew that faith had more than one language. Down in the valley, near the river, there stood a small stone cross. It leaned slightly to one side, worn smooth by wind and rain. The villagers said it had been there before the church was built, before even the road. No one knew who had set it there, or for whom, but each spring and autumn, someone always left a garland of flowers at its base. The priest called it unnecessary, an old superstition, yet he never removed the offerings himself. On All Hallows' Eve, the garland was of ivy and dried corn, tied with red thread. By morning, it would be gone, carried off by the wind or by something else that knew the meaning of gratitude. The fog thickened as the hours passed. The world outside the cottage blurred into a soft grey veil. Through it, faint shapes shifted, branches perhaps, or the shadows of passing clouds. The woman kept her eyes on the fire, knowing that to stare too long into mist was to invite what wandered there to notice you in return. She added another piece of peat to the coals, and the fire responded with a quiet sigh. The warmth spread slowly through the room, lifting the chill from the air. In the distance, faint music drifted through the fog. It was not the tune of any known instrument, more like the echo of a memory. Perhaps it came from the next village, where young men and women gathered to tell fortunes and share cider, or perhaps it came from farther away, a sound too old to trace. The woman smiled faintly, thinking of her youth, of nights when she too had danced in the fields after the harvest, the air thick with smoke and laughter, her bare feet cold against the earth. The dances were not called pagan anymore, though they were the same ones her ancestors had known. They had only been given different reasons. Now they were held in thanks for the season's end, not for the old gods. But the steps were unchanged, and the earth beneath them remembered. Not far from the village, beyond a low stone wall, the remains of an older world still slept beneath the soil. Farmers had found bits of it over the years. Smooth stones carved with spiral patterns, small figures shaped from clay, and once, a bronze brooch darkened with age. The priest had told them to discard such things, but most had not. They were kept quietly in drawers or boxes, tokens of another time, reminders that the ground beneath their feet had stories older than any sermon. On this night, the boundary between those stories and the present felt thinner than ever. The woman could feel it in the air, the way sound carried differently, the way the light from her candle seemed to shift at the edges. She closed her eyes and murmured the old blessing under her breath, a string of words that had no clear meaning, but held the weight of centuries. The syllables were soft, worn smooth by repetition, and when she finished, the air in the room felt steadier. She rose from her chair and crossed to the door, opening it just a crack. The night pressed in, cool and damp. The smell of wet earth and smoke filled her lungs. She took a small pinch of salt from her apron pocket and scattered it along the threshold, the grains glinting faintly in the candlelight. It was not an act of fear, but of balance. The salt, she believed, reminded the wandering spirits that this was a place of peace, not invitation. Farther up the lane, another cottage mirrored her actions. An old man stepped outside, wrapped in a heavy coat, his breath visible in the chill. He paused by his gate, tipping his hat toward the fog, as if greeting unseen travellers. Then he hung a lantern from the post, letting it swing gently in the wind. Its light glowed faint and steady, marking his home like a beacon. He whispered a few words, something between prayer and farewell, then turned back inside. Such small gestures tied the village together. They were not written down, not spoken of in church or school, but passed quietly from one generation to the next. When a child asked why salt was thrown on thresholds, the answer was simple: to keep the house clean. When they asked why a candle burned all night in the window, the answer came softer, so that those who wander know where kindness still lives. These were lessons in courtesy more than belief, and yet belief grew from them all the same. Inside the woman's cottage, the fire burned steady again. She sat once more, her hands resting in her lap. The cat stretched and moved closer to the hearth, its fur glowing faintly in the light. On the table, the bread and honey remained untouched, though she thought she saw the faintest shift in the candle flame beside them. It bent slightly, as if stirred by breath. She did not turn her head. The air felt watchful, not heavy, just aware. In another part of the valley near the river, a small chapel stood half in ruin. Its roof had caved long ago, and ivy climbed freely through the cracks. Yet each Halloween, someone placed candles along the old stone altar. No one ever saw who did it, but by dawn, the candles were always burned to the wick. The villagers said it was the work of children or of lonely souls, but the truth was less important than the act itself. The candles burned because they needed to, because something in the human heart still reached for connection across the years. As midnight drew closer, the fog began to thin. The moon appeared above the trees, pale and distant, casting a faint silver glow across the fields. The light revealed the shapes of the old stones near the moor, standing like quiet sentinels. The woman knew of them, had visited once as a child. Her grandmother had taken her there before dawn on a spring morning, telling her to place her hands on the stone and listen. She had heard nothing but the wind, yet afterward she had felt an odd calm, as though the earth had recognized her. That memory returned now, vivid and warm. A reminder that even the coldest land holds memory if one stands still long enough to feel it. In towns and cities, belief had changed its shape. There, Halloween was becoming a curiosity, something printed about in magazines, spoken of in polite circles as an old country fancy. The educated called it folklore, the poets called it mystery, and the scientists called it illusion. Yet among them were those who listened more closely, who felt the pull of something deeper. Some called themselves seekers, others spiritualists. They sat in dark rooms and asked the air for answers, unaware that the same conversation was happening quietly in every village hearth. The difference was only in the name. The woman did not think of such things. She thought instead of her own small world, the rhythm of seasons that guided her life. Planting, harvest, winter stores, and spring thaw. Halloween came like the hinge between them, the night when the last of the year's warmth gave way to the waiting cold. It was not a holiday so much as a marking of time, a reminder that what dies returns and what leaves behind must be remembered. She leaned forward and adjusted the log on the fire. Sparks rose and drifted upward, fading into the dark above the hearth. For a moment, they looked like stars. She smiled faintly, remembering the words her grandmother once said, that each spark was a soul passing through, pausing to see if it was still welcome. She had not believed it then, but now she was not so sure. The night had a way of making such ideas feel less like stories and more like truths told in a language older than understanding. The air in the cottage grew warmer again. Outside, the fog shifted, breaking apart in slow waves. Through the thin veil, the faint outline of the church appeared on the hill. Its windows glowed with candlelight, the only sign of life among the gravestones. The priest was likely awake, reciting prayers for the departed. The woman respected him, though she suspected he did not return the feeling. He saw the world in terms of right and wrong, light and dark. She saw it instead as a circle, everything connected, everything deserving of acknowledgement. She whispered a small blessing for him anyway, then leaned back in her chair. The fire snapped softly, echoing the sound of the wind against the shutters. Beyond the church, the first faint shimmer of frost began to form on the grass, catching the moonlight in tiny crystals. The night was deep, but not eternal. Soon it would turn toward morning, and the living would reclaim their world. For now, though, it still belonged to the old faith, quiet and unseen, breathing softly beneath the cross. The woman reached for the small bowl of water on her windowsill. Its surface was calm again, smooth as glass. She dipped her finger into it and touched the wood of the window frame, leaving a faint trace that caught the firelight. The gesture was neither prayer nor spell, but something between, a language of respect. Outside, the wind paused, and the candle flame steadied. She sat there for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the presence of all that had been and all that still lingered. Somewhere in the valley, a dog barked once, then fell silent. The sound travelled through the fog, low and hollow. The woman's eyes lifted towards the door, not in alarm, but awareness. The hour was turning again, drawing the night closer toward its heart. The fire crackled, and the shadows shifted. The house breathed quietly, patient and alert, as though waiting for what came next. The wind began to move before dawn. Not a storm, not even a restless gust, just the quiet stirring that comes when the world turns from stillness to breath. The fog that had held so thick through the night began to shift, pulling itself apart into long, thin threads that drifted low over the fields. The woman by the wood sat awake to see it. She had not slept, though she had closed her eyes from time to time, resting her head against the back of her chair while the fire sank into quiet embers. When she opened them again, the room had changed in its light, soft grey seeping through the cracks of the shutters, turning the air pale. The wind carried with it the scent of the moor, damp grass, heather, and the faint tang of peat smoke from distant homes. It slipped through the thatch and whispered under the door, gentle but insistent, moving small bits of ash across the hearth. The woman reached forward and stirred the coals with a length of iron, feeding the fire until the glow returned. The warmth rose again, chasing the damp from the air. She felt the shift of the hour, the slow turning of the night into morning, though no sun yet showed itself through the clouds. Outside, the village began to stir. A door opened somewhere down the lane, followed by the hollow clap of wood against stone. A man's voice called softly to his horse. The sound carried easily in the thin air, mingling with the sigh of the wind. The birds were slow to wake, as if even they felt the lingering presence of the night just past. The world did not shake it off all at once. It faded slowly, the same way a candle's smoke clings long after the flame dies. The woman rose, wrapping her shawl tighter, and crossed to the window. She drew back one corner of the curtain and looked out. The fog had lifted enough to show the shapes of the trees and the low stone wall that marked the edge of her garden. Beyond that, the fields stretched pale and endless, their stubble glistening faintly with frost. The first light of morning came weak and colourless, washing the world in grey. It was the sort of light that made everything look older, as though time itself had slowed to a crawl. She could see movement near the road, figures walking toward the village, their outlines blurred by mist. Farmers, likely, heading to check their livestock after the long night. A woman carrying a basket walked beside them, her skirt catching the wind, her head wrapped in a scarf. Their steps were slow but steady, and as they passed the crossroads, each one made a small gesture, a hand to the heart, a nod toward the old stone there. It was habit, not ceremony. They did not even notice themselves doing it. The crossroads had always demanded acknowledgement. The woman let the curtain fall and turned back to the hearth. She poured the water from the bowl on the sill into the fire, letting the steam rise and vanish. Then she refilled the bowl from a small pitcher and set it back in its place. Fresh water for the new day. It was a small ritual, one that needed no words. She swept the floor, gathered the cooled ashes from the hearth, and placed them in a clay pot near the door. The first task of the day was always to clean the remains of the last. As the wind strengthened, it found its voice in the eaves, humming low and constant. It was not unfriendly, but it carried weight. It moved through the trees in long sighs, bending the branches until they touched. The sound filled the valley, travelling from one hill to the next, a restless chorus that spoke of change. In the fields, the last of the harvest stubble rattled softly against itself. The ground was too hard now to plough, too cold to plant. The earth had closed for the season. The wind knew this. It moved over the bare soil like a hand smoothing cloth, sealing what had been done. To the people who worked the land, this was the true end of the year. The calendars in the church might mark January for beginnings, but here, among the crops and cattle, the year began and ended with the soil. Halloween was their hinge, the night that turned the circle. The villagers felt it in their bones. They did not speak of it much, but they carried the awareness the way one carries a scent, faint but always present. Even now, as the morning grew, They walked slower, listened more, their senses still tuned to the quiet hum of what lingered from the night before. The veil might have thinned for only a few hours, but the memory of it clung to everything. The air, the light, the look in a person's eye when they glanced over their shoulder for no reason. At the edge of the village, a group of children gathered near the well. Their faces were red from the cold, their hands tucked into sleeves. One of them held a bundle of sticks bound with twine. They took turns tossing pebbles into the water, counting the ripples, whispering things they had half forgotten from the night before. They had been told stories about spirits who lived at the bottom of the well, and though they laughed, none of them leaned too close. The oldest girl dropped a piece of bread into the water and watched it sink. Her grandmother had said it was for luck. The others followed, bits of crust and crumbs drifting downward until they disappeared in the dark. When they were done, they ran off toward the fields, shouting and scattering crows as they went. Inside the cottages, fires were rekindled. The smell of smoke and baking bread began to spread through the air. The wind carried it from house to house, mingling scents until the whole valley smelled faintly of wood and flour. It was comfort, familiar and grounding after the long, uncertain night. The living world reclaiming itself one breath at a time. The woman stepped outside for the first time that morning, closing her shawl tighter against the cold. The ground beneath her boots was slick with frost, and the grass crackled as she walked. The sky had begun to brighten in patches, pale blue breaking through the grey. The wind lifted her hair and tugged at her shawl, and for a moment she felt the strange, clean stillness that comes after something unseen has passed. The world felt empty, but not hollow, like a room just left by a guest who will return again someday. She walked to the small garden behind her cottage. The herbs there had long since withered, their stems dry and brittle. She knelt beside them, cutting what remained of the rosemary and sage, tying the sprigs with a thin piece of string. These would hang by the hearth for the winter, a reminder of green things in the months when the earth slept. As she worked, the wind brushed the hem of her dress, and the sound of it mixed with the rustle of the dry leaves. It was almost like a voice, low and steady, saying nothing she could understand, but something she recognized. She straightened slowly, her hands full of herbs, and looked toward the moor. From this angle, she could see the faint outline of the old stones in the distance. The light caught on them, dull and steady. She thought again of the stories told by her grandmother, of the wind that rose each year to carry away what the dead no longer needed, leaving space for the living to begin again. It was not frightening. It was only part of the turning. The sound of hooves came from the road. She turned and saw a cart approaching, the horse's breath clouding in the cold. The man driving it raised a hand in greeting as he passed. She nodded in return. He had a bundle of firewood stacked high in the cart, tied with rough rope. The village would need much of it soon. The winter promised to be hard. One could smell it in the air, that dry metallic edge that meant frost would come early. She went back inside and set the herbs to dry near the fire. The warmth of the room welcomed her back, and she sat for a moment, her hands resting in her lap. The cat leapt down from the chair and rubbed against her leg, purring faintly. She smiled and reached down to stroke its fur. The small sounds of morning filled the air, the creak of wood, the faint rattle of the window latch, the wind pressing in gentle intervals against the walls. In another cottage, closer to the church, an old man sat sharpening his scythe. The blade caught the light each time it turned. He was not cutting grass anymore. He simply liked to keep the tool ready a habit from years when his hands could not stay still. His wife called to him from the hearth, asking if he'd seen the lantern still burning by the crossroads. He said he had, and that it was strange it hadn't gone out yet. She crossed herself out of reflex, murmuring that someone should take it down before the priest saw. He nodded, though neither moved to do it. Some things were better left to fade on their own. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of the sea, though it lay miles away. It came through the valley like a long sigh, moving through the chimneys and down the lanes, brushing against the church bell that hung still and cold. The sound of it filled every hollow and crack, as if testing the strength of the world it passed through. The villagers looked up from their work, feeling it move through them too. The woman by the wood felt it as well, that same deep vibration that made the heart beat slower, that whispered of things both past and waiting. By midday, the light had grown stronger, though the sun remained hidden behind clouds. The wind kept its pace, steady and firm, bending the trees and carrying with it loose bits of straw and leaves. The villagers worked as they always did, tending fires, mending fences, feeding animals, but everything moved slower. They were tired, not from labour, but from the long keeping of watch. The night had taken a part of them, and the morning returned it in fragments. As the day went on, laughter began to return. The children ran between the cottages, chasing each other, their shouts rising above the sound of the wind. The men spoke louder now, their voices carrying easily through the thin air. The women set bread on windowsills to cool, and for the first time since dusk, someone began to sing. The song was an old one, with no known beginning, hummed more than spoken. It drifted from house to house until it seemed the whole village shared the same breath. The wind eased then, as though listening. It softened at the edges, no longer pushing, only circling. The fields shimmered faintly under the muted light, the frost melting into thin silver threads. The world felt awake again, but still touched by the weight of what had passed. The old faith lingered, not as doctrine or story, but as presence, woven into the breath of the land, the rhythm of wind against stone, the sound of fire meeting air. The woman sat once more by her hearth as the afternoon light faded. She watched the smoke curl upward, carrying with it the last scent of the herbs she had hung. The wind continued outside, quieter now, wrapping the world in a low, steady murmur. It would carry on through the night, over fields and rivers, through the ruins and the stones, reminding everything it touched that nothing ever truly ends, only turns again. The fire flickered softly, and she leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed. The sound of the wind filled the silence between her thoughts. It was the same sound her ancestors had known, the same voice that had moved through the valleys for centuries, older than names, older than the cross, older than belief itself. She listened to it until it became her own breathing, steady and unhurried, carrying her through the long hours toward whatever waited next in the turning of the night. The road that wound past the village curved toward the moor, a narrow strip of earth pressed flat by hooves and cartwheels, its edges overgrown with heather and broom. On mornings like this, when the wind had quieted but not vanished, the air along that road felt strange, alive in a way that made even the most ordinary traveller keep their pace steady and their eyes on the path ahead. The villagers called it the Old Road, though none could remember when it had first been laid or by whom. It had existed longer than the church, longer than the manor house on the hill, maybe even longer than the names carved on the weathered stones at the crossroads. They said the road was once used by women who walked alone, the kind who carried baskets of herbs and whispered to the air when no one else was near. the kind who knew the taste of every root and the sound of rain before it came. Some called them healers, others called them witches. The word shifted in weight depending on who spoke it and what hour of night it was spoken. In the 1800s, the witch was a figure balanced between memory and invention. The fires of the old persecutions had long gone cold, but their smoke still lingered in the corners of people's minds. The stories were softer now, but they carried the same shape. There was always a woman who lived apart from the rest, who spoke to no one unless she must, who tended her own garden with care and whose animals never sickened. And when misfortune came, a failed crop, a child's fever, a cow gone dry, it was to her door that people went first in anger and last in need. The woman by the wood knew these stories well. She had heard them since girlhood, whispered behind hands or told in low voices near the fire. Sometimes her own name found its way into them, carried by gossip that began as curiosity and ended as caution. She never denied it. To do so would only feed the talk. Instead, she lived as she always had, quietly and with purpose, letting time itself dull the sharpness of suspicion. There was another woman once, years ago, who had lived beyond the moor, where the land dipped toward the marsh. Her name had been Ellen, and the villagers still spoke of her when the nights grew long. She had been neither young nor old, with hair the colour of ash, and eyes so pale they seemed to belong to another world. Ellen had known every plant that grew on the moor, and people came to her when their animals took ill or when a birth came early. Her hands were steady, her words calm. She never charged money, only asked for bread or a bit of milk. But one spring, when a sickness passed through the village and 3 children died, someone said it must have been her doing. The fear spread like rot through the air. They went to her cottage one night with torches shouting her name. By morning, the cottage was gone, burned to the ground. The wind carried the ashes across the marsh, and no one ever found her. Some said she fled to the sea. Others said she had simply walked into the mist and kept walking. The woman by the wood had been a child then, too young to understand, but she remembered the smell of smoke and the silence that followed. For years afterward, no one spoke the word witch in daylight, but the herbs still hung from rafters and charms were still buried under thresholds. Belief does not die with a single fire. It only hides for a while. By the middle of the century, the world outside the village had changed. The cities had grown crowded and loud. The railways cut through the countryside, bringing news and strangers and things that could not be hidden anymore. Newspapers printed stories about seances, about men who spoke with the dead through raps on tables, about women who fell into trances and described the faces of lost souls. The educated called it spiritualism, but to those in the old villages, it sounded familiar. The world of spirits was not new to them. It had only been given a new name, one that could be spoken without shame. The woman listened when travellers brought these stories. She did not mock them. She knew that the dead had always spoken. Only now people had learned to listen with instruments instead of instinct. In her own cottage, she kept the same habits she always had. Herbs for healing, salt for protection, water for seeing. The difference between a witch and a healer, she thought, was only the direction of the wind. When people needed her, she was the first kind. When they feared her, she became the second. One afternoon, she walked the path beyond her garden, following the road that led to the moor. The air was sharp and dry, the sky wide and colourless. Her boots pressed soft into the damp earth, leaving shallow prints. The wind had quieted since morning, but it still whispered through the tall grass, carrying the faint rustle of unseen wings. The woman stopped now and then to gather plants that still clung to life in the cold. Yarrow, tansy, a bit of late-growing mugwort. She tied them together with string and slipped them into her basket. Each had a use, though some she carried only out of habit, the way one might carry an old charm long after forgetting what it meant. The moor spread before her, vast and empty. The stones stood at its centre, grey and rough against the pale sky. She approached them slowly, feeling the change in the air as she did. The sound of the wind dulled, as though swallowed by the ground itself. She placed her hand on one of the stones and closed her eyes. The surface was cold, but not dead. It held the memory of warmth, of sunlight caught long ago and released slowly through the years. She stood there for a while, listening, not for voices, not for spirits, just for the quiet pulse that ran beneath the world, steady and old. When she opened her eyes again, the land looked different, though nothing had changed. The light had shifted slightly, casting the stones in a soft gold. She turned and began the walk home. In the village, people watched her from a distance. They always did when she went walking that way. Some said she went to speak with the dead. Others said she gathered charms from the stones. None dared follow. Still, when sickness came or a child fell ill, they knocked on her door. They brought eggs, candles, sometimes coins, though she rarely took them. She gave them herbs, words to speak before sleep, small tokens tied with thread. And when the illness passed, they crossed themselves and said it was God's will, not hers. But they always came back. There was comfort in her presence, though few would admit it. The doctor in the next town travelled by carriage once a month, but he was expensive and often too late. The priest's prayers were kind, but they did not cure a cough or ease a broken limb. The woman's remedies worked often enough to keep her tolerated, never enough to make her safe. Once, in late autumn, a man came to her door in the dark, his hat in his hands, his eyes red from worry. His wife had fallen ill after childbirth, and no medicine had helped. The woman listened quietly, nodding as he spoke. She took a jar of honey from the shelf, mixed it with a handful of crushed herbs, and gave it to him with instructions. "Keep her warm," she said. "No noise in the room. Leave a candle burning at the window." He thanked her and left without looking up. A week later, the wife recovered. The man told everyone it had been the grace of God, but he still left a basket of apples on the woman's doorstep each winter until he died. Such was her life, half gratitude, half suspicion, each balanced so neatly against the other that neither side ever fully tipped the scale. When the wind rose again one night, carrying the sound of the moor through the valley, the villagers stayed inside. The woman did not. She stepped out into the dark, her shawl pulled tight, and followed the path toward the stones. The moon was high and bright, the sky clear for the first time in days. The air held that sharp stillness that comes only after a long wind, when the world seems to hold its breath between storms. She reached the edge of the moor and stopped. The stones stood ahead, their shadows long against the frost. She could hear nothing but her own breathing and the faint rustle of grass. She knelt and laid her hand on the ground, feeling the cold bite of earth through her skin. In the distance, an owl called once, its voice hollow and brief. The stories said, witches danced here once, under moons like this, their fires bright enough to be seen from the village. They said the air had glowed and the ground had trembled. though no one alive had seen it. She did not think of those stories now. She thought only of the turn of seasons, of the weight of the soil, of the quiet hum that lived in all things. She whispered the same blessing she always did on nights when the wind changed, a simple string of words that meant balance more than power. The cold deepened as she spoke. Her breath hung in the air, drifting upward like smoke. When she finished, she stood and turned back toward home. The path behind her glowed faintly under the moon, the frost catching the light in silver threads. By the time she reached her cottage, the fire had burned low. She fed it with new wood and sat near it until warmth returned to her hands. The cat lifted its head, blinked once, then went back to sleep. The world outside still moved with quiet purpose, the wind brushing against the walls in slow, steady breaths. In the church, the priest wrote his sermon by candlelight, unaware that his own words would echo hers more closely than he knew. He would speak of faith, of endurance, of unseen strength guiding the living through the long winter. And in the cottages beyond his window, the same themes would play out in smaller ways. Hands tending fire, voices murmuring blessings, hearts listening for signs in the quiet. The witch's path, the priest's prayer, the farmer's labour, they were all the same line drawn through different soil. Each sought balance in a world that refused to stand still. Outside, the wind shifted once more, moving down from the hills, circling the valley like a slow turning wheel. The woman by the wood listened to it, her eyes half closed, her breath steady. She did not think of herself as a witch. She thought of herself as part of the rhythm that had always been. She did not conjure the wind, she only heard it when it came. The fire cracked softly, the sound small but certain. The light flickered along the walls, tracing shadows that swayed in the motion of the air. Beyond the window, the night stretched on, neither kind nor cruel, only waiting, the same as it always had, the same as it always would. The following evening, the air turned heavier, as though the world had taken a long, slow breath and held it. The sky lowered itself over the valley, thick with a colourless cloud that dulled every sound. Even the wind, which had wandered restlessly through the moor and village for days, fell quiet. The woman by the wood felt it before she saw it, the way stillness pressed against the walls, the way the cat lifted its head and stared toward the door without moving. The fire burned steady, the light from it holding close to the hearth, as though unwilling to travel far. She sat at her table, a small knife in her hand, trimming the ends of a candle she had made that morning. The wax was pale and smooth, the wick dark against it. Each candle she made was shaped by the same pattern, tall enough to last the night, narrow enough to fit the small iron holders she kept by the window and near the door. She did not count how many she had made over the years. Candles were not meant to be counted. They existed to burn, to mark time, to hold the line between light and dark a little longer than it might hold on its own. The table was crowded with small things, bundles of herbs, a small bowl of salt, the stub of another candle still warm from use. Everything had its place, its reason. She worked without hurry, her hands steady, her breath measured to the rhythm of the flame beside her. The world outside could shift and fade as it pleased. Inside, the pattern remained. She melted a bit of wax over the fire, the faint smell of honey and smoke filling the room. When it had softened, she dipped her fingers into it, shaping the base of the new candle until it stood upright on the plate before her. The act was simple, but it carried weight. Each candle was both ordinary and sacred, a piece of labour and a quiet conversation with the unseen. To those who might visit her for help, the light of these candles was what comforted them most. It was the sign that her work was gentle, that her intentions were clean. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the window. The sound was slow and uneven at first, then steadier. The woman looked up, her eyes following the streaks of water down the glass. The rain carried the smell of earth, of leaves, of iron. She let it fill the silence for a while before returning to her work. On a small shelf above the hearth sat a shallow wooden bowl. Inside it lay a ring made of woven rushes, bound with a thread of red wool. She took it down carefully, brushing the dust from its surface. The ring was old, the fibers brittle in places, but it held its shape. It had been made long ago, before her time, before her mother's time perhaps, and passed down quietly through the years. It was a circle of protection, meant to be hung above a doorway during the dark half of the year. Her grandmother had hung it each autumn, just as she did now, not because she believed it would stop harm from coming, but because it felt wrong to leave it aside. Tradition was not always about belief. Sometimes it was simply about remembering to do what had always been done. She stood on her chair and hung the ring once more above the door. The red thread caught the candlelight, glowing faintly in the dim room. She stepped down and looked at it for a moment, satisfied. The rain thickened outside, turning from a whisper to a steady hum. The sound wrapped around the house like cloth. The woman lit another candle and placed it near the window. The flame flickered once, then steadied. She watched it a while, listening to the soft rhythm of the rain. There was comfort in this kind of weather, when the world seemed sealed off, when the line between inside and out was clear. Nights like this carried no fear, only the deep, slow pulse of the living earth. She sat again and opened the small wooden box she kept beneath the table. Inside were bits of ribbon, dried flowers, a small mirror, a handful of old coins. Some she used for charms, others she kept for reasons she no longer remembered. She took out the mirror and held it up to the candlelight. The glass was uneven, its surface slightly warped from age. It reflected her face faintly, as though showing a memory rather than the present. Her eyes lingered on it. Mirrors were strange things. They did not lie, but they did not tell the full truth either. Her grandmother had warned her never to leave one uncovered overnight, not because of vanity, but because the glass could reflect more than it should when the world between light and shadow grew thin. She placed it back in the box and closed the lid gently. From somewhere outside, she heard a voice, a faint sound, distant but clear enough to stir her attention. It might have been someone calling for a lost animal, or a traveller caught in the rain. She rose and opened the door a little, letting the cold air slip in. The rain fell harder now, the night behind it thick and dark. She could see nothing beyond the small pool of light spilling from her doorway. The voice came again, softer this time, carried by the wind in a way that made it hard to tell from which direction it came. She listened for a long moment, then closed the door. Not every sound was meant to be answered. She returned to her chair, took up her knitting, and began to work by the light of the 2 candles. The rhythm steadied her hands. Each movement pulled her further into calm. The sound of rain and the whisper of wool against wood merged into a single, steady pulse. The warmth from the hearth spread slowly through the room, softening the edges of the night. At times, her thoughts drifted, to the woman Ellen who had once lived beyond the moor, to her grandmother's hands shaping bread at the hearth, to the feel of summer air before the long winters came. These memories didn't come as stories, but as small moments, single images carried on the surface of her mind. They lived beside the present like faint reflections, always near, never intrusive. The line between living and memory blurred easily in such quiet hours. The candles burned low, their light softened, turning gold against the walls. The woman set down her knitting and reached for a fresh one, lighting it from the dying flame of the first. The moment of transfer, when one wick caught and the other faltered, always held her attention. The brief flicker between life and extinction, the passing of light without loss. There was a lesson in it, though she had never found the right words to name it. Outside, the rain began to fade. The sound of it softened to a few scattered drops, then ceased altogether. In its place came the faint creak of branches and the distant sound of water running through the ditches along the road. The air carried a different scent now, cleaner, sharper, like stone washed by fresh rain. The woman rose, went to the door, and opened it once more. The world beyond was still. The clouds had broken just enough to reveal a thin strip of sky, faint stars trembling above the dark silhouette of the trees. The air felt colder, the kind that drew the breath sharp from the lungs. She stepped outside, candle in hand, shielding the flame with her palm. The light swayed with the wind, but did not go out. She walked a few steps into the yard, her boots pressing softly into the damp ground. The earth glistened faintly, small puddles catching the weak light. She turned in a slow circle, looking toward the edge of the wood, the distant curve of the road, the faint glow of other fires far across the valley. Every window seemed to hold a candle tonight, each one a small echo of her own. She stood there for a while, listening. The silence was not empty. It was full of small sounds, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft drip of water from the eaves, the slow sigh of the wind through grass. These were not just noises, but signals, reminders that everything moved in its own quiet pattern. The circle above her door, the candles in her hand, the fire in her hearth. They were all part of the same rhythm, repeating itself through generations, holding the fragile connection between what was seen and what was felt. When she went back inside, she placed the candle on the table and watched the flames settle once more. The air had cooled, and she pulled her shawl closer, but she did not feel lonely. The quiet filled the room like company. The old clock on the shelf ticked softly, marking each second as if reluctant to let them pass. The woman closed her eyes and let her thoughts drift toward rest. In the village below, others did the same. Some prayed, some whispered names of the dead, some simply stared at the light of their own small candles until sleep took them. The night held them all equally, the same slow breath passing through every wall and roof. The circles drawn in salt, the threads of red wool, the prayers half remembered, all carried the same purpose, to remind the living that they were part of something wider than themselves, something that watched and waited, neither cruel nor kind, just endless. The woman stirred once more to feed the fire. The flames rose with a low crackle, throwing a new warmth into the room. The candlelight merged with it, soft and steady. Outside, the stars shifted behind a new bank of cloud. The wind returned, faint and slow, moving around the cottage in long, even breaths. The hour grew late, but the woman did not yet sleep. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the flame. The candle burned evenly, its wick steady, its wax melting in perfect rhythm. She watched until she could no longer tell whether the flicker she saw was in the air or behind her eyelids. The night pressed close again, quiet but full. Somewhere beyond the walls, the first faint rustle of leaves began, a hint that the wind was gathering once more. preparing to move through the valley and over the fields. It would find every doorway, every circle, every small light left burning through the dark and carry their smoke upward into the unseen spaces between worlds. The woman finally rose, set the candle in its holder near the window, and whispered a few words before turning toward her bed. The words were simple, old as breath, meant not as command but acknowledgement. The flame wavered, then steadied again. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carries no joy and no sorrow, only quiet certainty. The world outside shifted, slow and patient. The candles burned through the hours, one by one, their light never wasted, their smoke curling upward into the dark where no line could be drawn between this world and the next. The candles had burned through the night. Their wax had pooled and hardened along the edges of the table, pale streaks of quiet labour marking the hours that had passed. The woman woke before dawn, as she always did, the faint smell of smoke and beeswax still heavy in the air. The fire had gone down to a slow red glow, its heat soft against the chill that crept in through the walls. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and sat up, listening. The world beyond the cottage was silent, the kind of silence that belongs only to the space between night and morning. She rose slowly, her bare feet brushing the cool floor, and crossed to the window. A grey light hovered just beyond the glass, neither dark nor bright, the colour of breath held before speech. The ground outside was covered in a thin layer of frost, glinting faintly where the light began to gather. The air looked still, but she could sense movement beneath it, a quiet shifting, like footsteps on soft soil. This was the hour she always felt most aware of the other side, not midnight as the stories said, but the cold hour before dawn, when the last of the night's weight had not yet lifted and the living world had not quite taken hold. The air carried that strange sense of company, subtle, impossible to name, but real enough to make her pause before moving. She opened the door a little, letting the cold air spill inside. The mist hung low across the fields, so close it seemed to move with breath. She could smell the faint sweetness of wood smoke from distant chimneys, the scent of damp earth, and something else, older, sharper, like iron and rain. The kind of scent that did not belong to weather at all, but to presence. She stood there quietly, listening. There were stories told by the elders, stories of nights when the spirits walked openly, not to frighten, but to visit. They were not ghosts in the way city folk spoke of them, not the pale, hollow things of seances and drawings, but shadows of memory, pieces of those who had lived, still lingering in the folds of the world. The people who stayed close to the land did not fear them. They spoke of them as guests. Some even left bread or milk by the door, not as offerings, but as courtesies. The woman did the same. It was a small act, but it mattered. She went to the table and cut a piece of the brown bread she had baked 2 days earlier. She placed it on a wooden plate beside the door, along with a small cup of cider. The bread was hard at the edges, the cider cool, but that was fine. The spirits, if they came, did not eat or drink as the living did. They absorbed the gesture, not the food. She placed the plate carefully, the wood creaking faintly beneath her hand. The cat moved to the doorway, stretching before sitting down, its eyes fixed on the space beyond. Animals saw differently. They did not name what they sensed, did not reason it away. The woman watched the cat for a long moment, following its gaze. There was nothing visible in the mist, no sound except the slow drip of melted frost from the roof. Yet the feeling of company grew stronger. She closed the door gently, but did not bar it. The old latch was enough. She went back to the fire and stirred the coals, feeding them a few pieces of dry wood. The flames rose again, soft and steady. She warmed her hands, her breath misting faintly in the cool air. Behind her, the cat flicked its tail once and then began to purr, low and constant. The stories her grandmother told came to her easily this morning. She could still hear the old woman's voice, rough with age but steady, telling how, on the night after All Hallows, the spirits of the kind-hearted dead were allowed one last visit to the world they had left behind. They came to see their homes, to check on the living, to rest for a moment near the warmth of firelight before returning to the silence they called home. It was said that if the house was quiet, if the candles were lit and the hearth tended, the spirits would pass peacefully, leaving behind a sense of calm. But if the house was cold or dark, if the living forgot to keep watch, then the spirits might linger too long, unsettled. The woman had kept that teaching all her life. She had never known fear of the dead, only respect. The dead were not enemies. They were reminders of work unfinished, of love unspoken, of the fragile thread between presence and absence. On mornings like this, she felt them most clearly. The air inside the cottage shifted. It was not wind. Every crack and window was sealed tight. But something more subtle. The flame of the candle nearest the door bent slightly, as if stirred by a breath. The woman did not move. She watched it steady again, the wick glowing bright for a heartbeat before returning to normal. It was enough. She knew the sign. She murmured the old words softly under her breath, the ones she always used when acknowledging what passed unseen. They were not prayers in the way the priest would understand, but neither were they spells. They were greetings, small words meant to keep harmony between what lived and what watched. She spoke them slowly, her voice barely above a whisper, letting each syllable rest on the air like dust on sunlight. The room seemed to ease in response. The air lost its heaviness. The candle flame brightened, its light stretching just a little farther. The woman let out a slow breath and sat back in her chair. She had learned that moments like this should never be forced. You could not summon the dead. You could only make room for them. The spirits came when they wished, for reasons the living could not fully know. Sometimes they came to comfort, sometimes to be remembered, sometimes only because habit drew them back to the warmth of a place once called home. Outside, the mist began to lift. The first hint of sunrise touched the tops of the trees, turning their frost into faint sparks of gold. The world began to move again. The lowing of cattle from the fields, the creak of wagon wheels on the road, the slow rhythm of waking life. The woman rose, went to the door, and looked out once more. The bread and cider were still there, untouched, but she noticed something new. A single feather, pale grey, lying on the step beside the plate. It had not been there before. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her fingers. The edges were smooth, the down soft. It might have blown there by chance, but she did not think so. She set it on the mantel above the fire, beside the rowan sprig that hung there. It felt right to leave it in a place of warmth. In the village below, others were waking to small signs of their own. A door left ajar that had been closed the night before. A candle that burned longer than expected. A scent in the air, sweet, familiar, fleeting. These things were not spoken of loudly, but each person noticed in their own way. And when they passed one another on the road, they met eyes briefly, exchanging quiet looks that said more than words could. The night had been peaceful. The visitors had come and gone without trouble. The balance held. By midday, the mist was gone entirely. The sky cleared into a pale blue, thin as linen. The wind returned, light and quick, carrying with it the dry rustle of leaves. The woman spent the day as she always did, tending the fire, mending her clothes, preparing the herbs she had gathered earlier in the week. But her movements carried a quiet satisfaction. The air in the cottage felt lighter now, the space somehow wider. That night, when she lit her candles again, she paused before striking the flint. For a moment, she thought she heard faint music outside, a few notes carried by the wind, too distant to be sure of. She waited, listening. The sound came once more, soft, brief, fading before she could tell from which direction it came. She smiled faintly, then lit the candle. The flame caught quickly, bright and steady. In the hours that followed, she felt no unease. The spirits had come and gone. The house remained as it had always been, quiet, balanced, alive in its own slow way. She knew they would not return again until the next turning of the year. Between now and then, the days would grow shorter, the nights longer, the cold deeper. But she would not be alone. The living world had returned to itself, and the silence that remained was not emptiness, but peace. As the candle burned low, she sat by the fire and listened to the wind moving through the valley. It brushed against the walls and roof like a familiar hand, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke from distant hearths. Somewhere out in the darkness, the moor lay still, the stones gathering frost once more. The woman leaned back, her eyes half closed, her breathing slow. There were no boundaries now, no sharp lines between night and day, between past and present, between the living and the remembered. Only the slow rhythm of the earth, turning as it always had, carrying everything. Spirits, shadows, breath and silence, together through the long hours. She whispered a final good night to no one in particular, though perhaps to more than one, and let the fire settle into embers. The room dimmed around her, warm and still, and somewhere beyond the door, unseen footsteps faded into the wind. The night held steady, neither beginning nor ending, only moving forward, soft as breath, into whatever waited next. By the time the first snow touched the fields around the village, word of strange gatherings had begun to travel down from the towns and cities. The carters who came through spoke of drawing rooms lit by gaslight and crowded with people who sat holding hands in silence, waiting for tables to move or for voices to rise from the air. They said it was called a seance, that even doctors and men of learning took part in them. The woman by the wood listened when she heard such stories, though she never spoke her thoughts aloud. She had no reason to doubt the tales. City people had only found a new way to do what country people had always done: listen for the dead. In the city, the nights carried a different kind of stillness. The air was never truly dark, never truly silent. Smoke hung above the rooftops, catching the light of lamps that lined the narrow streets. The sound of carriage wheels echoed between the walls, mingling with the cries of vendors and the low hum of conversation that never seemed to end. Yet inside certain houses, behind heavy curtains and locked doors, another kind of quiet reigned, a silence made not by absence, but by expectation. In one such house, far from the fields and moor, a group of people gathered. It was late in the year, the air sharp with frost, the windows misted from within. The drawing room was large, lined with dark wood and shelves of books that smelled faintly of dust. Candles burned low on the mantel, their light trembling across framed portraits that watched from the walls. In the centre of the room stood a polished table, round and heavy, its surface gleaming like still water. Around it, 12 chairs were placed in a perfect circle. The guests arrived in pairs, gentlemen in dark coats, ladies in long dresses, their faces pale in the candlelight. They spoke softly at first, exchanging polite greetings, laughter that sounded thin against the heavy air. But as the clock struck 9, the room fell to quiet. They took their seats, hands resting lightly on the table. At the head sat a woman, her hair pinned high, her eyes closed even before the others had settled. She called herself a medium, though she preferred the word listener. Her voice when she spoke was calm and low. "We are gathered," she said, "in peace and in trust. No harm may enter here, no falsehood may remain." The words were familiar to them all. They had been printed in pamphlets, repeated in parlours from London to Edinburgh, passed along as if they held the same weight as prayer. The guests murmured their assent. The medium's hands moved outward, her fingers finding those beside her. The circle closed. For a long time, nothing happened. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock and the distant crack of a carriage wheel on the street below. The candles flickered, their shadows stretching and shrinking across the walls. The guests waited. It began with a faint tremor beneath their hands, not enough to move the table, only enough to be felt. A few eyes opened, glancing at one another. The medium did not move. Her voice came again, softer now. "If any spirit wishes to speak, we are listening." The tremor came again, stronger this time. A gentleman to her left drew a sharp breath but did not pull away. The table shifted, a slow, deliberate movement, as though stirred by a pulse deep within the wood. One of the candles flared suddenly and then returned to normal. The medium's head tilted slightly. "There is a presence," she whispered. "Not near, but not far." Her words fell into the stillness and hung there. The guests leaned forward. Somewhere in the corner, the floor creaked, a small, uncertain sound. The medium's lips moved, but the words were barely audible. Then, slowly, she opened her eyes. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt dense, close. One of the ladies at the far end of the table shivered. Her hand tightened on the gentleman's beside her. The table trembled once more. A sound rose, faint, uneven, like breath drawn through hollow wood. The medium spoke again, but her voice no longer carried its usual tone. It came low and distant, as if spoken through her rather than by her. "You have called," she said, "and I have come." A murmur rippled through the room. The guests glanced at one another, half believing, half afraid to admit they did. The gentleman nearest her cleared his throat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The answer came slowly, stretched across the air like smoke. "A friend," the voice said. "A watcher." The clock ticked once, loud in the quiet. The flame of a candle bent sharply, its wax running in a thin line down the holder. The medium's head bowed, and for a moment she seemed to struggle for breath. The guests sat frozen, unsure whether to speak or to break the circle. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence lifted. The air cleared. The table grew still. The medium straightened, her eyes open again, clear but distant. She looked at the faces around her and smiled faintly. "It is done," she said. The guests released their hands. Some exhaled. Some laughed nervously. Some reached for the glasses of wine waiting by the wall. The air in the room seemed to lighten, as though the act itself had lifted something from them. No one asked what they had spoken with, or whether it had been real. It was enough that the silence had answered at all. In the weeks that followed, the same gatherings continued across the city. Parlours that had once hosted card games and poetry readings now held circles of silent believers waiting for the table to speak. Newspapers wrote of it with equal parts fascination and mockery. Scientists attended, claiming to test the phenomenon with wires and weights. Some found trickery, some found nothing. But most found a feeling they could not name, a sense that the air itself held memory. The medium from that night became well known. Her name appeared in pamphlets, her portrait sold in shops. She spoke in public halls to crowds who came to see her fall into trance and whisper words that none could explain. To many, she was proof that science and spirit might yet share the same world. To others, she was only another performer. But those who had sat in her circle knew that for one brief moment, something had moved. Whether within or beyond, they could not say. Far from the city, the woman by the wood heard of these things as gossip carried by merchants passing through. She would listen as she weighed her herbs or mended her shawl, nodding quietly at the mention of spirit talk and table rapping. When the travellers finished, she would smile and say only, "The dead have always spoken. They just listen to them differently now." To her, the idea that the dead could be reached through furniture or flame was not strange. The living world was full of echoes. Every word spoken carried a trace of those who had come before. She did not need a circle of fine wood and crystal to hear it. The stones on the moor, the wind in the chimney, the soft movement of the fire, those were her instruments. Yet she did not mock the city folk for their attempts. Perhaps it was good that they were remembering again. In the city, the movement grew. Parlours multiplied, and with them came a kind of quiet rebellion. Women who had been told to remain silent in church now spoke with authority in the language of the unseen. Men who had mocked old superstitions found themselves sitting in dark rooms, waiting for a knock that might carry a message from someone they loved. The air of reason that had ruled the century began to thin, replaced by curiosity and longing. It was said that in one house on Baker Street, a table rose entirely from the floor, turning in slow circles before settling again. In another, a voice spoke through a trumpet, calling a name that no one present had ever heard. Such stories travelled quickly, changing a little each time, but always carrying the same message. The line between life and death was not as firm as it seemed. Late in the winter, the woman by the wood found herself thinking more often of these distant rooms, not with envy, but with a strange sense of recognition. The people who sat around their tables were not so different from those who left bread by the door or hung circles of rush above their hearths. They were all reaching for the same thing, proof that what they loved was not lost, that the world still held echoes of every voice that had ever spoken. When the wind carried the sound of the church bell across the valley that night, she listened with her eyes closed. It sounded different somehow, not a call to prayer, but an invitation to remember. The same sound, the same rhythm, but a different meaning. Just as the city had found new words for old acts, the valley too was changing. In the weeks to come, she would hear of writers who claimed that the old gods were stirring again, hidden beneath the language of science and faith. She would hear of gatherings in gardens and forests, where people lit candles not for spirits, but for the earth itself. She did not yet know the word others would give to it, revival, but she could feel it already, a slow, steady movement beneath the surface, older than the cities, older than reason. For now, she sat by her fire, listening to the crackle of the logs and the low sigh of the wind against the door. The city was far away, but the sound of its awakening seemed to drift even here, faint but clear. The world was remembering itself, piece by piece, in parlours and in cottages, in whispered names and in silence. The candles burned low again. She reached out to trim the wick, her hands steady, her face calm. Beyond the window, the night spread soft and deep across the fields. Somewhere far away, a table might have turned, a voice might have spoken, a crowd might have held its breath. And here, in the quiet heart of the countryside, another woman listened to the same silence, the same unseen hum that linked them all. The fire cracked once, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. She watched them rise and fade, each one disappearing into the dark like a thought unspoken. The air was still, but not empty. The world felt full of presence, of memory, of things that had no need for names. The city would go on with its seances and its experiments. The valley would go on with its candles and its charms. Between them, the same thread stretched, invisible, unbroken, carrying the same quiet question through time. The woman leaned back, her eyes half closed, the faint light from the fire brushing across her face. The hour was late, but she did not yet sleep. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, and the sound carried far before fading. The world was wide and full, alive with the murmur of all that had been and all that would be. She listened until the silence returned to stillness, then let the night settle around her once more. Winter lingered longer than usual that year. The frost held tight to the ground, refusing to lift even when the days began to stretch again. The air carried the scent of smoke and wet earth, the kind that settles deep into stone and clothing. The woman by the wood kept her fires burning almost constantly, the steady crackle of the logs filling the silence of her cottage. Beyond the village, the world was stirring again, though in ways most people could not see. The merchants who passed through brought news of a changing season, not of weather, but of thought. In the cities, they said, people were looking backward as much as forward. Poets wrote of ancient gods and sacred groves. Painters filled their canvases with symbols that felt older than their time. And scholars argued in coffee houses about whether the old faiths had ever truly died. The woman listened when these stories reached her, not with disbelief, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had lived inside the thing others were just now rediscovering. The travellers spoke of men who climbed hills at midsummer to watch the sun rise, and who gathered at stone circles by moonlight, tracing their hands over carvings half buried by moss. They called it a return to nature, a reawakening of what had been lost to industry and smoke. She thought of it more simply. The earth reminding its children where they had come from. The old beliefs had never been far away. They had survived in gestures, in habits, in the unspoken rituals that marked the passing of each season. They lived in the way a farmer touched the first furrow of spring soil, or the way a mother whispered over her sleeping child when the wind changed direction. The world beyond might have forgotten their names, but the acts themselves had carried on. Now it seemed that the city folk were learning them again, dressing them in poetry and reason, giving the ancient rhythms new language. In one of the stories told by the travellers, a group of scholars had gathered at a ruined abbey on the coast to mark the solstice. They had lit fires in the crumbling cloister, recited verses in the old tongues, and stood silent as the sun rose over the sea. One of them, it was said, had declared that the light of reason had gone too far, that the world needed mystery again. The others had nodded solemnly, as though they were saying something new, not realizing that the same words had been spoken in cottages and fields for centuries. The woman smiled faintly when she heard it. People were always rediscovering what had never been lost. As the weeks passed, the weather softened. The frost withdrew to the shade, and small shoots began to appear along the roadside. The woman walked the path beyond her garden, the earth damp beneath her boots, the air filled with the scent of thaw. The moor stretched wide and pale, its heather still dull from winter, but waiting for colour. She could feel it in the ground, that low hum of life returning. The circle of stones at its centre stood unchanged, but something about them seemed sharper in the new light. She approached them slowly, her hand brushing the air just above their surfaces. The stone felt cold even in the rising warmth, as though it belonged to a temperature the living could not touch. She closed her eyes and stood still. The wind moved lightly across her face, carrying the scent of the sea from far away. Somewhere deep in the stone she could almost hear a sound, not a voice, but a vibration, the echo of centuries layered beneath her feet. She thought of the people who had once gathered here, their fires bright against the night, their voices rising in song or prayer. She could not imagine their faces, but she knew their intent, to honor what sustained them, to give back what they took, to keep balance with the unseen. The woman lingered a while, letting the silence settle around her. Then she turned back toward the village. The sun had climbed higher now, washing the frost from the roofs and casting long shadows across the fields. The air smelled of wet grass and smoke. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of a bell, not the church bell this time, but the one hung in the square to mark the beginning of market day. Life continued as it always did, steady and practical, even as unseen shifts took place in the wider world. In the city, the revival had grown beyond the small gatherings of poets and thinkers. Societies formed, each with their own symbols and rites, each claiming to recover some hidden truth of the ancient world. They studied the stars, the turning of the seasons, the old festivals that had long been buried beneath Christian names. They wrote of sacred fires, of the balance between darkness and light, of the eternal cycle of birth and decay. Newspapers began to print their ideas, half in fascination and half in mockery. Yet their words spread. Even those who did not believe found themselves drawn to the sound of them. There was comfort in the thought that the earth itself might be alive, that time was not only progress, but return. The woman heard these things and thought of her grandmother's stories, of the midsummer fires, of the first loaf baked from new grain, of the songs sung to call the sun back at winter's end. The world was speaking in circles again, she thought. What had once been whispered in secret was now printed in ink. The difference was not in the meaning, but in the noise. The city needed to name everything it touched, to make symbols where there had only been acts. But the meaning remained the same. Light, dark, seed, harvest, death, renewal. The pattern did not change, only the way people chose to see it. One evening, as dusk settled over the village, she sat outside her cottage with a cup of tea, watching the smoke rise from the chimneys. The air was mild, the first real softness of spring, and the ground smelled fresh and alive. A pair of crows flew low across the field, their wings beating slow against the fading light. The sound reminded her of the stories she had heard that week, of people lighting fires in old stone circles, of songs sung in forgotten languages, of dances that traced the shapes of the sun and moon. She wondered what those people felt as they stood among their ruins and recited their new prayers. Did they think the old gods listened? Did they imagine the earth answering? Perhaps they did. Perhaps, for a brief moment, they felt what she had always known, that the act of remembering was enough. The that the power lay not in the words or the fire, but in the stillness that followed them. When darkness came, she lit her candles as she always did. Their light spread gently through the room, warm against the growing cool. She placed one on the windowsill, another near the door, and a third on the table beside her. The flicker of flame cast moving shadows across the walls, shapes that seemed almost to breathe. She sat and watched them, her hands folded in her lap. The revival, she thought, was not a beginning. It was a return. Every few generations, the world forgot itself and then remembered again. The forms changed. Temples became churches. Chants became prayers. Firelight became candlelight. But the impulse was the same, to find connection in a world that kept moving forward too fast to see what it left behind. Outside, the wind stirred the branches of the trees. The sound was gentle, like breathing. She rose and opened the door, letting the air in. The night smelled of damp soil and wood smoke, the same scent that had filled the air for centuries. The stars were faint through the thin veil of cloud, their light old and steady. She stood for a while, watching the horizon where the last trace of daylight faded. Somewhere out there, in another part of the world, people were lighting fires and speaking names they thought were forgotten. She smiled faintly, knowing the names were not important. The act of remembering was what mattered. She closed the door and returned to her chair. The cat had curled itself near the hearth, its tail wrapped neatly around its body. The fire burned low, its glow deep and steady. She thought of the city again, of the parlours and the scholars, the circles and their candles. They were looking for the same thing she felt now in the quiet of her home. The sense that something greater moved beneath all things, not watching or judging, only existing. The candle nearest her flickered once, its flame bending toward her before steadying again. She reached out and placed her hand on the table beside it. The warmth of the wood met her skin, grounding her. She whispered a few words, not to anyone, not even to herself, but simply into the air. Words of thanks, of recognition, of balance. The kind that carried meaning without needing to be understood. The revival, she thought again, would come and go. The city would tire of its symbols, as it always did, and turn to something else. But the earth would remain. The old faith would remain, quiet and steady, waiting for those who listened. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it the scent of rain. She rose to close the shutters but paused before doing so. Across the field, she could see a faint light, another window, another candle burning late. Perhaps it was a neighbour, perhaps not. Either way, it felt like an answer. She left the shutters open and watched the light until her own candle burned low. When at last she went to bed, the world beyond her walls moved in its slow rhythm. The turning of the wind, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant sound of water running somewhere unseen. The revival might have been happening far away, but its pulse reached even here, carried through air and memory, through earth and fire. She felt it settle around her as she drifted towards sleep, not as noise or revelation, but as calm, the steady heartbeat of something far older than belief. The night deepened, and the candles flickered one by one, until only their faint scent of smoke remained. Outside, the rain began, soft and even, falling across the valley, washing the world clean for whatever would come next. The mirror had been wrapped in cloth for most of the year, tucked into the back of the cupboard behind jars of dried leaves and a tin of buttons that no longer matched anything. Its edges were nicked, the silvering along the back worn to a faint cloud where fingers had held it too many times. The glass was not perfectly flat. It carried slight waves that bent the light, enough to make a face look unfamiliar when the room was dim. The woman unwrapped it slowly at dusk, setting the folded cloth aside with the care one gives to tools that should not be woken carelessly. She cleaned the surface with a damp corner of linen, wiping until the last streak disappeared and the glass held the room like still water. She placed it on the table and backed the frame with a square of black fabric so that nothing from the room could reflect behind it. The candle near the window burned low. The one beside the door was new, the wick trimmed near to perfect. She moved the mirror an inch to the left, then another to the right, until the candle on the table lit the glass without throwing her own outline too sharply into it. When the angle settled, she sat. She did not use the mirror for names or dates. She did not seek faces. The mirror was for reading the room more than the future, the same way one reads weather from the way a branch swings or the way smoke climbs. The glass held movement differently than air. It gathered light in a narrow place and showed where it bent. If the night pressed too close, the mirror made it clear. If the air steadied, the mirror showed that too. She watched without staring. Her eyes fell to the rim of the frame, the small seam where old wood met older silver, then lifted to the center, not long enough to call anything forward, only long enough to note the shape of the flame in the glass. It held steady, a small oval with a thin blue base, the edges even. She let out a breath she hadn't noticed she was holding and set both hands flat on the table. The cat jumped up onto the chair across from her and folded itself neatly, tail tucked, chin on paws. The room smelled of tallow and rosemary, the floor cool under her shoes, the air dry from the afternoon's fire. She reached for the bowl and brought it beside the mirror. The bowl was wooden and shallow, the inside rubbed smooth from years of washing and a little salt kept in it when the weather turned damp. She poured water from the pitcher, enough to cover the bottom to a depth no thicker than a finger. The surface settled at once. No ripple moved. She placed a second candle behind the bowl so that its light fell across the water and into the lower edge of the mirror, making a narrow bar of brightness that the eye could measure without effort. The house quieted as the hour slipped forward. Outside, the last carts had gone in from the road. A dog barked once from the far end of the lane, the sound coming thin through the cold. The wind pressed a loose shingle somewhere along the back eave, and then let it go. She knew each of these sounds, the way one knows the voices of neighbours. None of them asked for attention. She returned her gaze to the strip of light across water and glass. The old woman who raised her had said that a mirror on an autumn night was like a door left on its latch. The room was still private, still safe, but the latch wanted a hand on it. One did not look into the glass with need. Need made corners out of harmless curves. One looked with the same patience one used for bread, for dye, for earth that could not be hurried. A mirror hurried no one. It only showed what the air had already decided. The flame along the rim lengthened and narrowed again, not a quiver, but a breath. The water threw a line of brightness upward that broke for a heartbeat into two lines, then returned to one. The woman did not tilt her head or lean closer. She shifted nothing. In the corner of the frame where the silver wore thin, a faint smudge appeared and then cleared. Old silver did that. She marked the pattern in her mind and left it there. When she was a girl, she and her cousin had gone to a neighbour's house on an autumn night and watched older girls sit with mirrors at their knees and apples in their hands. They had said if a girl combed her hair at midnight, she might see the shape of a husband pass behind her shoulder in the glass. Her cousin had laughed too loudly and been sent away. The woman had watched from the doorway and seen only candle and braid and the tremble of a wrist that wanted to believe. The room had held more hope than air. Years later, her cousin married a cooper and moved to a town by the river. No one spoke of mirrors again that winter. People stopped speaking of many things each winter and picked them back up in spring. She lifted the bowl and turned it twice clockwise on the table, so a new face of the water met the candle. The line of light shifted with it, clean and unbroken. Behind the mirror, the black cloth drank the flame until only a thin halo remained. She set the bowl down and wiped a stray drop from the table with the edge of her sleeve. The table held marks from knives and hot pots set down too quickly. Her hand passed across them without thought. The wood had belonged to 3 kitchens before this one. A mirror remembers in its own way. A table remembers in another. Sometimes a face did seem to rise in the glass. Not a face anyone living would know. Not even a face with features clear enough to sketch. More the sense of an outline that leaned where the room did not lean. A weight where the room had been weightless. When that happened, she did nothing. No greeting, no name, no startle. She let the air show her what it needed to show, and then go still again. There were seasons for making and seasons for keeping. A mirror was for keeping. Down in the village, a miller's wife had tried a different method that same week. She had set 3 candles in a row and a pan of water at her feet, each candle no higher than the last. She sat with her back to the hearth and watched for a sign that a sick brother would mend. The smallest candle bent toward the pan until the wick brushed the brass lip and guttered. That was enough for her. The brother's fever broke 2 days later. She kept the pan under her bed afterward and never spoke of it except to her sister. The priest preached that Sunday on the dangers of resting hope in devices. The miller's wife took bread from her oven and did not attend. The woman by the wood trimmed the table candle and cleared the small curl of wick before it could fall into the wax. She folded the black cloth's edge tighter behind the frame so no stray reflection could creep up from the floor. The cat shifted to the second chair and pressed its spine against the slat, eyes half closed, tail thumping once in a way that meant contentment rather than warning. She drew her thumb along the frame where a bead of pitch had risen in summer heat years ago and hardened. The bead had always looked like a drop of ink about to fall. It would never fall. It was not only the mirror that steadied a room, it was the order around it. The broom leaned where the broom should lean. The kettle handle faced the door. The iron poker angled inward, not outward, so that no coat could catch on it in the dark. The herbs hung at a height that cleared a man's hat, but brushed a child's hair. The small woven circle above the door was tied at the top, not the side. These things mattered in the way that good stitching matters to a boot that must be worn through rain. The foot might never notice the stitch, but the road would. She lifted the mirror and carried it to the hearth, holding it toward the embers so the warmth would drive any damp away from the backing. The silver along the rim threw back a reddish sheen like fruit skin. She set it on the mantel and waited while the heat softened the chill out of the glass. The fire answered with a low crack that sent a tiny puff of ash up the flue. She opened the damper a finger's breadth, then closed it again. On nights like this, drafts behaved like animals. They followed routine. When she returned the mirror to the table, the water in the bowl had changed. Not in shape, not in depth, but in the way it held the room. The candle's line had broadened across the surface a fraction, as if the grain of the wood beneath had shifted from the warmth of the hearth an arm's length away. She rotated the bowl a quarter turn and the line narrowed again. She marked the angle of the narrowing and left the bowl in that position. A sign was often no more than a steady thing revealed by a change one could measure. The door latch clicked once without movement. Wood dries and swells. Iron remembers the last hand that touched it. The sound was not new, but the hour gave it weight. She stood and set an extra pinch of salt at the threshold where the stone wore a shallow curve from years of feet passing. The grains glittered in the low light and then dulled as they settled. She wiped her fingers on her apron and returned to the chair. A neighbour's boy had come to her 2 autumns past with a blackened spoon and a story about smoke that went nowhere when his mother brewed tea. The boy had eyes that always moved to the corners of a room first. He watched the mirror with suspicion, as if it might cut something from him and keep it. She had set the mirror aside and poured water into a plain tin cup instead, showing him how steam drifted toward the coldest part of a room until air grew even. He had nodded and not moved his eyes from the mirror until he left. He came back each spring after that for willow bark and forgot to fear the glass. People eased into tools the way they eased into rivers. First a foot, then a hand. Then the body went where the water was already moving. In the city, a gentleman with spectacles so small they pinched his nose wrote a pamphlet on reflective scrying and called it an extension of optic principle applied to metaphysical inquiry. A shop on a narrow street sold black mirrors made of polished stone, wrapped in velvet, and explained in printed instructions how one must sit, how long one must breathe, what one must eat beforehand to ensure that the mind did not agitate the surface. He spoke at a hall where gas jets hissed along the cornice, and gentlemen took notes while he described evidence collected from 50 households. His diagrams were clean. His terms were new. His hands shook a little when he set the stone down. He had watched his sister fade the winter before and had not slept until spring. The woman kept her glass. Polished stone had a place, but glass carried years along its face and knew the habits of a room. A thing that knew habits kept a steadier boundary. The candle burned lower. She brought a fresh one, warmed its base in a saucer's worth of wax, and fixed it to the plate at the table's far edge, so the 2 flames made a narrow corridor in the glass. The corridor pulled her eye forward. She did not walk down it. She let the corridor exist without entering it, the way one lets a path cross a field without stepping off the road one has chosen for the day. The cat's ear flicked. Outside, a rooster crowed from a yard where the rooster always misjudged the hour on nights when the moon's light came thin through cloud. The crow was a thin sound, a string pulled once and let go. She folded the cloth that had wrapped the mirror and laid it across her knees for warmth. The edge had been hemmed by her mother's hand, the stitches small, knotted every so often in the neat way that women who could not afford to redo a seam learned to knot. She followed the line of those knots with her fingertip while the candles kept their lane. The flames threw a soft twin onto the water that remained 2 bodies until a faint draft paired them and then released them. Pairs formed and fell apart on their own. No instruction helped there. She remembered a story from the far country west of the moor, the kind that rides in with a hawker and rides out again a winter later. A girl had sat with a mirror and a bowl and waited for a sign. A soldier appeared behind her shoulder in the glass, solemn and thin, and the story said she married him the next harvest and buried him the next winter. The woman had never repeated that one to any young listener. There was no use in it. A mirror carries enough without lending it, a grief it cannot put down. A knock came that was not a knock. The lintel settles when the frost pushes under it. The shelf above the hearth leaned a breadth of a hair across the years, and even the smallest shift sounded like a finger against wood. She counted to 12 under her breath and listened for a second report. None came. The air returned to its long, slow thread. She reached behind the mirror and drew the black cloth down an inch so a thin crescent of the wall's pale lime showed beyond the rim. The oval of flame in the glass changed shape in that narrow margin. It told her what she wanted to know. The room was even. No corner drank more light than another. The bowl's water did not pull toward any side. She slid the cloth back up and smoothed the fold. There was no call tonight. There was only the quiet that followed a call answered on another night. She lifted the bowl and poured the water into the pail for washing. The last film clung to the wood in a dark circle before it sank into the grain and disappeared. She wiped the rim with her thumb and set the bowl upside down to dry, the ring of light from the candle edging its foot. She snuffed the far candle with the lid of the salt jar and left the nearer one burning a while longer, so the mirror could cool without taking the room with it. When she wrapped the glass again, she laid the linen smooth, corner to corner, and tied it with twine rather than the ribbon she used for holy days. The ribbon kept its dye better when spared the scent of tallow. She slid the mirror into its place in the cupboard, behind the jar of bay leaves and the tin of buttons that would never find the coats they were cut from. The door closed with a soft catch that the hand learns by heart after enough years. She listened for the clink of wood against wood that meant the latch had seated. It did. She moved through the room, making the small corrections one makes after long attention, has fixed on a single surface. The poker angled a degree too close to the coals. She eased it back. The window latch felt loose, and she pressed it home. The loop of rush above the door sagged a finger's breadth, and she lifted it until the thread took weight again. The kettle had sweated from steam along its handle, and she dried it so the iron would not rust where the eye could not see. The work was small, and the kind that no one praised. No house stands through a winter without it. The cat slid from the chair and rubbed its flank along her shin, then moved to the hearthstone and took the warmest square. She set bread to toast on a trivet and turned it before it darkened, scraping the little char that was not unkind to her stomach, but would not be welcome so late in the day. The smell filled the room more than a mirror ever could. She ate without hurry, the crust corner by corner, and set the plate by the basin for washing. Outside, the lane gave up its last footfalls. The frost grew again along the fence rails and sparkled in a way that no glass could hold. She did not think of omens. She thought of work. In the morning there would be wood to split and a shawl to mend, and a walk to the hedge where wind always lodged a drift that wanted a path cut through it on heavy days. The mirror would stay where it was until the next night that called for it. The water would keep to its bowl or to the kettle. The candles would do what candles do and die in clean cups of wax that could be warmed and poured back into the moulds when she had enough stubs to bother with. On the far edge of the parish, a widow sat with a mirror of her own that night, set flat on the table so it showed only ceiling and flame. She held a letter from a son gone to sea and read the lines 3 times until the ink felt warmer than the paper. When she looked down, the flame doubled in her glass and she smiled, not for what she saw, but for what the act of seeing steadied in her. She wrapped her mirror in a shawl when she had finished and put it into a drawer with the letter. The two rested together like neighbours who did not speak, but knew the boundary between their gardens would hold. The woman banked her fire and left one candle at the window. The wick had burned clean. The pool around it would harden into a ring that could be coaxed out tomorrow with a blunt knife. She knew the sound the knife would make when the circle lifted. It was a small click, a sound like the stitch of a seam pulled true. She turned down the bed and sat for a moment, letting the quiet do what it does when it gathers itself at the end of a long hour. The mirror had not asked for more of her than that. Neither had the bowl, neither had the night. The room wore itself like a garment that fit. Beyond the cottage, the moor lay in its usual shape, low and broad, the stones holding their temperature the way stones do. No ceremony drew its mark across them tonight. No voice carried far. The valley slept, the church steeple's lead cold to the touch of moonlight that found it through cloud, the square's bell dark and still. In houses along the lane, a plate left by a door had been taken up and washed, a crust thrown to hens for morning, a cup emptied on the step so it would not attract ants when spring came. These were the endings that made room for beginnings that were not dramatic enough to tell. She lay down and felt the weight of blankets that had been mended along the same lines for years. The stitches made a map against her knees. She knew their course without looking. The candle at the window cut a thin lane on the wall that slid as a draft shifted and then stopped. She closed her eyes. There would be other nights with glass. There would be nights with nothing but a hand on the table and the measure of a flame. The work held either way. The line between seen and felt stayed where careful hands set it each evening. The house held the setting. The season did the rest. In the morning she would open the cupboard and see the wrapped square of the mirror behind the familiar jars and tins, and know it was ready without wanting. That was enough. The year was turning steadily through its darker run, the fields locked, the hedges holding their frost, the birds making short work of whatever seeds had shaken loose in the last wind. The mirror would keep its place. The water would take its shape. The candle would keep its length until cut. She could feel the next part of the season approaching, not in any vision, but in the way the timber in the wall gave back a dry sound when tapped, and the way the air at the edge of the blanket cooled faster than the air at the center. It was a sign with no story to lean on. It did not need one. The body knows when the deeper cold begins, and when light will not return quickly enough for a while. The house knows it too. Hinges thicken. Latches ask for oil. Bread keeps a day longer on the shelf. Everything prepares by doing what it always does with slightly more care. The candle guttered once and righted itself. She slept. The room stayed as it was, ordered, plain, ready. The small tools of keeping placed where the hand would find them by reach alone. The mirror rested under cloth, quiet as a field under frost, not empty, not full, only holding, the same way the land itself holds until the next use calls it forward. And the night moved on, as it always did, toward the hour when wind changes and stone sweats, and the first thin bird song lays a thread across the air that will, given time, pull the rest of the day through after it. The first true thaw of winter began without warning. One morning the frost simply didn't return. The air had softened overnight, and the ground, though still firm, carried that faint scent of water loosening beneath it. The woman noticed it before she opened her eyes. The difference in the sound of the wind, the lightness in its touch against the walls. When she stepped outside, the trees dripped slowly, each drop landing with a dull sound against the half-frozen mud. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and wood smoke. She stood in her yard, breathing it in, watching as mist gathered low over the fields. It wasn't the pale grey mist of deep winter, but something fuller, carrying a trace of warmth. It clung to the hedgerows and the low dips of the land. curling through the grass like living breath. She could hear it too, the quiet shift of things waking beneath it. Not all at once, but little by little, like a body returning from sleep. The thaw always came with small messes, the ditch near the gate flooding, the path turning slick, the woodpile damp at its base. She worked through them as she always did, without complaint or hurry. Each year this was the way. The earth broke its stillness, the house adjusted to the change, and she followed the rhythm until it settled again. But this year, something in the air felt different. The quiet did not lift in its usual way. It stayed heavy, expectant, like the pause before a gathering. That evening, the mist thickened. By nightfall, it had rolled down from the moor and filled the valley. The village below vanished into it, the lamps by the square glowing faintly through the grey, no more than dull sparks in an ocean of cloud. The woman could barely see the hedge beyond her yard. Yet the air did not feel closed or suffocating. It felt open, as if something had widened in the dark. She lit her candles early and drew the curtains, though she left the one nearest the door unshuttered. The flame wavered gently, steadying after each flicker. She ate her meal in silence, listening to the faint hum that lived inside the fog, that deep, low sound the earth makes when its boundaries blur. The cat sat near the door, tail wrapped neatly, its eyes fixed on the small gap beneath the curtain. From time to time its ears twitched, but it made no sound. Around midnight, the first knock came. Not hard, not hurried. Just 3 slow raps against the wood. The kind made by a hand that knows the place well. She did not startle. The hour for such things had long since passed her fear. She set down her cup, rose from her chair, and opened the door. The mist poured in around her feet. The world outside was white, without shape. She could see no figure, only the faint glow of her candlelight reaching into the fog and stopping a few steps away. Still, she could feel the presence of others, not the living kind, the kind that moved without weight, that pressed against the air, but left no mark on the ground. She stepped aside as she always did when the air called for it, and let the door remain open. The first of them passed through without sound, a faint ripple in the candle flame, a shadow without edges. Then another, and another. They did not crowd, did not rush. They moved in a slow, deliberate line, as though following a path only they could see. Each one carried its own temperature, a brief shift in the air, cold near her cheek, warm near her hand, gone before she could turn. The night's procession had begun. It came once every few years, though never on the same date. The old people used to say it followed no calendar, only the need of the earth. When the ground softened after long frost and the mists returned from the moor, the veil between worlds loosened just enough for those caught within it to pass through again. They came not to haunt or to speak, but simply to move, to walk the paths they had once known, to feel the air, to see the places they had left behind. The woman had seen it twice before in her life, once as a girl, from her window, once again in her middle years, when she had been outside cutting herbs late at dusk. Both times it had filled her with the same quiet awe. There was no fear in it, no malice, only the steady rhythm of presence passing by. Now, standing in her doorway, she could hear them in the fog. Faint, even footsteps, light but sure. No metal, no fabric, just the bare sound of air shifting with each pace. She held the door open and stepped back, keeping her eyes low, not out of submission, but respect. Through the mist they came, one by one, some tall, some bent, none clear enough to name. She could see outlines, shoulders, the curve of a head, the faint hint of hands. A few carried small lights, soft as will-o-wisps, barely visible except when they passed close. The air grew cooler each time one moved through, then warmer again when the space cleared. She stood there for what might have been an hour or only minutes. Time behaved differently during such crossings. It stretched and folded, following the pace of the procession itself. She did not count, did not try to see where they went. The path was not meant for the living. Inside, the candles burned low. Their light moved across the walls in long, slow arcs, as though carried by a hidden breeze. The cat had retreated to the far corner beneath the bench, its eyes wide but calm. The woman's breath came slow and even. The line outside continued, steady and endless. Eventually, the mist began to thin. The last of the shapes moved past her door, each one quieter than the last. When the air grew still again, she waited a while longer, listening for any sound. None came, only the slow dripping from the eaves. She closed the door gently and fastened the latch. The room felt changed, not colder or warmer, just full, as if something had been restored. She walked to the table, straightened the wick of the nearest candle, and sat. The quiet that followed a procession always carried its own weight. It was not emptiness, but completion. For the rest of the night she did not sleep. She sat and listened to the faint hum that lingered in the air, the echo of steps now gone. Sometimes it seemed to come from far away, as though the procession had stretched beyond her sight, moving along the valley road, through the village, past the square, and on toward the fields. She imagined it winding between the trees, crossing the marsh where Ellen's cottage had once stood, following the river until it dissolved into dawn. When the first pale light of morning seeped through the window, the fog still lay thick over the ground. The village below was silent, the church bell still. The woman rose, opened her door once more, and looked out. Across the yard, the grass glistened with moisture, each blade silvered with dew. And there, in the centre of the path leading toward the gate, lay a single footprint, faint, shallow, already softening in the thaw. She stepped closer and studied it. The shape was not clear enough to tell whose it might have been. Perhaps it was hers, made by mistake. Perhaps not. She left it as it was, unwilling to disturb what had passed. By midday, the mist had lifted completely. The sky above was pale blue, the kind that carries no warmth but promises it soon. The villagers went about their work without mention of the night. Some looked tired, as though they had woken too early. Some carried a faint calm, the kind that lingers after a good dream. No one spoke of what they might have seen or felt. Such things were not discussed. They were lived through and then left alone. The woman spent the day quietly. She swept the floor, trimmed the wicks of her remaining candles, and gathered dry wood from the edge of the wood where the sun reached. The air smelled new, though still damp. By evening the sky had darkened again, but the mist did not return. The procession had gone back to wherever it came from, leaving the living world lighter for its passing. She sat by her fire, the cat asleep at her feet, and thought of what she had seen. Not with wonder, not even with gratitude, but with a calm understanding of someone who had glimpsed the slow machinery of things. Life and death, frost and thaw, silence and sound, all parts of the same procession, endless and even. The night had simply shown her a truer rhythm. Outside, the road gleamed faintly in the moonlight. A cart passed in the distance, its wheels soft in the wet earth. Somewhere beyond the hills, the river ran high with meltwater, its current strong but steady. The air moved with quiet purpose again, not heavy now, but smooth and open. The season had turned another notch in its great wheel. She leaned back, the warmth of the fire on her face, and closed her eyes. The hum she had heard the night before still echoed faintly, not in the air now, but within her. It was the same rhythm she had felt since girlhood, the sound of the world's endless breathing, sometimes louder, sometimes nearly lost, but always there. The night's procession was over, but the motion of it remained. The unseen steps carried on somewhere beyond reach, crossing from one quiet to another, circling back in ways no living map could hold. And in that steady movement, the woman found her own place again, as small and as certain as a flame in a long corridor of dark. The candle burned low beside her, its wax running slow and sure. The last of the mist slipped away from the valley. The night went on, neither strange nor sacred now, just alive, moving forward in its own unbroken way. The morning after the mist withdrew, the light came thin and even, a sheet of pale linen laid across the valley. Frost had fled from the hedges and gathered instead along the ditch, where it could keep to shadow until the sun found it. The woman woke before the first bird tested its voice and lay still for a while, measuring the room by sound. The chimney drew in a slow, obedient way. The rafters gave their small winter cracks. Somewhere near the door, a mouse reconsidered the gap it had explored in the night and turned back, as if remembering the taste of salt at the threshold. She rose and set her feet to the floor, feeling the board's old give, the forgiving dip that years of standing had pressed there. The air against her face was cool, but not hard. It carried the smell of damp ash and a sweetness that did not come from anything in the room. It was the kind of sweetness a field exhales after thaw, when the skin of the world loosens and breath returns to what lay tight all winter. She coaxed the fire, set water to heat, and opened the door on the yard. The ground wore last night's wet in blunt patches. The rowan at the boundary held new buds no larger than a pinhead, each one closed as tight as a fist. The sky moved in slow panes of cloud that let the light through in an even wash. She stood on the threshold long enough to hear how far the day reached. A horse ringing its bit in the lane beyond the hedge, a shutter lifted against stone, a kettle lid set down in a house where someone worked with a careful hand. It was not a busy morning, it was a watchful one, the kind after a turning, when people step lightly over old tracks and take inventory of what remains. She ate at the table with the window uncurtained. The glass held a fine skin of moisture that broke in lines when the first warmth reached it. She ran a cloth along the sill and found a grit of dirt she did not mind, proof that the night had not sealed the world entirely. The cat came and went in narrow arcs, testing the yard, and returned with its paws dark to the ankle. She wiped them one by one while it tolerated her, then set it down and watched it fold into the warm square at the edge of the hearthstone. The day's work took its shape without talk. She carried the ash to the plot where she meant to turn ground when the month allowed. She cut twine into lengths for peas. She set aside a shawl to mend where a splinter at the gate had tugged a thread. These were ordinary tasks, which was their use. Ordinary makes a brace for what might otherwise lean too much. Each time her hand paused, it did not pause at nothing. It paused on the edge of some old seam that rose unasked. The shape of a hand placing bread by a door. The sound a kettle made when a grandmother lifted it with wrists that shook after long illness. The angle of sun on the stones at the moor, when a girl's legs were new to the distance. The day carried no ghosts. It carried a good weight of memory, evenly distributed, the way a well-packed cart takes a rutted road. By noon, a pale warmth gathered in the yard. She set the chair outside and brought the shawl to her lap, the needle threaded and pinned briefly in the wool while she pressed the cloth flat with her palm. A cart passed along the lane with its axle oiled. Even the creak sounded subdued, as if the wood had learned courtesy from the thaw. The driver lifted a hand. She nodded, then bent to her work. The needle found its course easily, dipping in and out of the wool, drawing a line that would not be seen but would be felt each time the shawl took weight on her shoulders. Mending leaves no song behind, but it keeps the tune. The village moved along its usual path. 2 boys tested the thin ice in the shaded ditch with sticks and found it softer than their courage. A woman shook a rug too close to the hedge and sent a cloud of dust to settle on her neighbour's wash. A short quarrel followed, and then a laugh. The bell on the square rang once and stopped. Not for church, not for alarm, just a habit kept so people could count their bread in quiet agreement. A man patched a fence with boards that did not match, and in mismatched boards there was a comfort too. Proof that what breaks can take a second life. She finished the line of mending and ran the pad of her thumb across it to feel the seam level with the rest. Then she set the shawl over the chair back and let the sun work its small warmth into the damp wool. The breath that left her chest carried winter out with it by degrees. The breath that returned came in tasting of thawed earth and distant smoke. No hour announced itself as special, and yet each settled like a page pressed smooth beneath a hand. That was the way after a night that carried something through. Not a rush forward, not a slackening either, but a settling. The world remembers by returning to its tasks and finding them in place. She took down the woven ring above the door to check its bind after months of wet. The rush had dried hard. The red thread held. Where the thread had frayed, she wet her fingers and twisted it back into itself until it lay neat. The ring would go up again at dusk, not as a guard against anything in particular, not for show, but because leaving things where they belong keeps the rest from wandering. When she set it back in its place for now, she felt the door give its small assent. That minute change in balance a house makes when a familiar weight returns to the beam. In the far field, a plough lay turned on its side, shiny where frost had polished the metal and dull where last year's clay still clung. She walked the boundary and stood with her hands in her pockets looking toward it long enough to measure the week by it. Soon the ground would take iron again. Soon lines would cut the brown and make order that seed could understand. Between the lines and now stood the quiet of days like this one. She took the measure without anxiety. Work comes when it comes. The soil tells it better than a calendar can. On the way back, she stopped at the rowan and pressed her thumb to a bud. It did not yield. Good. Things that rush at opening do not close well. She picked a twig that had lost its tip to weather and set it among the kindling by the door. Between her fingers, the wood gave off a clean scent that lived closer to memory than to flower. Her mother had smelt the same when she snapped a winter sprig years before and warned her, gently, to leave the tree whole when it could be left. Taking a little and leaving the rest is how a household makes terms with its place. She set the twig with care so it would be the first thing Flame found that night, not the last. Inside, she rinsed the basin and replaced the water on the sill, watching the surface steady into a flat coin. She had no work for the mirror that day. The bowl alone held time well enough. Every surface that keeps still long enough becomes a mirror of something. She let the water show her the window and the sky beyond, not for sign, simply to note the way the light widened since a fortnight passed. The widening did something to a person's posture. Even without thinking, the shoulders settled back a degree, the jaw unclenched by a breath. She set the basin by and took up the broom. Sweeping after thaw is a lesson in patience. Grit clings to corners, and the corners cling to grit. The room taught her where to begin years ago, and she did not argue with it now. First the hearth edge, then beneath the table, then the seam where the wall meets floor by the cupboard. She shook the broom without moving the dust, and then gathered it. Each little pile held winter's arithmetic. A pinch of ash, a thread from a frayed cuff, a grain of dirt tracked in and forgotten. She cast it to the yard where the chickens would turn it into something useful underfoot by morning. Afternoon took its easy hold. A kettle hissed in a neighbour's house. The thin cry of a hawk cut once through the layered day and was gone. The square's bell rang twice, and from habit alone a handful of faces turned toward it, measuring the light by sound. She sat again with the shawl and made a second line where the wool had thinned. Not because it would fail this season, but because a thing is easier kept than recovered. That belief ran through everything she did, and through the village too. The way folk set aside a little flour when they could. The way fences gathered small repairs before they amounted to a break. The way even quarrels were mended before they hardened into history. When dusk moved along the hedges, she brought the ring down and hung it true, the red thread catching the last of the light. She lit one candle, then another, trimmed each wick until the flame held its clean, upright shape. No words were needed. Light at the right time is its own line of speech. The room gathered itself around those small fires and laid down the day like a tool returned to its hook. As night took the yard, the lane answered with single footsteps, then quiet. A door bolt slid. Another did not. The world makes a record every evening of who trusts the air and who trusts the wood. She worked by the table, mending the turn of a pocket that had begun to sag, while the cat made a low, satisfied sound and surrendered to sleep. The house smelled of bread again, faintly now, mixed with wool and the steady, almost invisible scent of tallow the candles shared. She did not mark the procession in words. She marked it in what it left behind. The footprint at the gate had softened, and by afternoon, gone. The cup left by the door for courtesy tasted of cider when she rinsed it, but held no other trace. The candle's shoulder wore a run of wax steadier than she herself could have poured. None of that asked telling. It asked only keeping. She kept it in the only place such things stay kept, in the body sense of a day set right. Memory is a practice more than a shelf. Later, when the wind swung once from the northeast and brought with it a hard lick of cold that surprised the evening for a moment, she fed the fire the rowan twig. It took easily and burned with a small, clean glow that meant more to her fingers than to her eyes. She held her hands toward it and let the warmth kiss the ache out of joints. The cold had taught prudence. While she stood like that, a picture set itself against the inside of her lids without permission, her grandmother's hands in the same posture, palms forward, the skin as thin as onion paper, and the bones like reeds. No sermon carried more instruction than that image. The body learns its teachers and repeats them without fuss or banner. Far off, the church bell stroked the hour. It did not sound like a call. It sounded like a stitch pulled tight in a seam that ran through houses and hedge and the worn stones of the square. She breathed in time with it without deciding to, then bent and lifted the kettle to settle it half a thumb nearer the coals. The water would be ready when it needed to be, not before, not later. Timing is how care proves itself. She poured and drank, and with each swallow another thin layer of winter slid off the day. There would be more cold. The year was not so generous as to give warmth at once and keep it, but something had moved that would not move back. She felt it in the ease with which the chair took her weight, in the way the window pane held the room without fogging, in the quiet behind her ribs where attention lives when it is not on watch. In the houses down the lane, others did their small bookkeeping of the season. A man rolled a barrel half a turn and chalked a mark on it to show how far it had gone since last autumn. A girl picked wax from a saucer and pressed it into a single lump the size of her thumb, then stored it with a gravity that would have made a city person smile and would have made her grandmother proud. A widow folded a letter and placed it again in the drawer where she kept it with a thimble and a scrap of ribbon, and in the drawer's scent of paper and metal and dye, she found the day steady itself 1 degree. When she put her sewing away, she did not end the hour. She moved it forward by laying each thing where the morning would find it. The needle slipped into the cloth's hem. The thread returned to its tin. The chair went back beneath the table, with its leg turned the way it preferred, so it would not wobble when the next task asked patience. The basin's water, untouched all day, winked once when she passed and then stilled. Even silence reflects. She banked the fire and left one candle on the sill, where its modest circle of light pushed itself a hand's breadth onto the yard. No invitation lay in it. It was simply a sign that a room inside kept order. The night answered by settling close without pressing. Stars hid and showed behind a slow lid of cloud. The last bird signed the page and shut it. She stood a moment with her hand on the doorframe and felt the timber's cool grain, the little nicks she could name if asked, and the long, unbroken line the wood drew between roof and floor. The house was older than she. It would remember her when she left it, not with pictures, but with softened places where a hip had brushed, with hinges that swung sweetly because oil had found them each spring, with thresholds worn by the kind of steps that do not quarrel with their purpose. She lay down and let the weight of blankets close like a book. The candle's light made a narrow ladder on the wall that she did not climb. It climbed by itself until a draught tilted it and then laid it down. Between her and sleep stood nothing but the good tiredness a day of ordinary tasks earns. The procession had taught the night a new gait, and the day had learned it, heel to toe, toe to heel, through chores and small mercies. What she carried now would be there in the morning without being clutched. The dawn would not arrive as a trumpet, but as the same pale sheet it had been today, laid gently across the valley, smoothed by hands that had done this 1,000 times. Somewhere beyond the moor, the river shifted its banks a finger's breadth, and no one would know until a fence post leaned in spring. Somewhere under the churchyard, a root found a path and lifted a stone by the thickness of a coin. Somewhere a fox marked the edge of a new run, and a hen would learn to sleep higher for a while. These were the movements that gave memory its dawn, not the shouting kind, but the kind that places the cup where the hand expects it and keeps a promise without announcing it. She slept as a kept room sleeps. The night turned another small degree. The candle lowered its shoulder and left its circle on the saucer clean. In the dark, the seam she had sewn in the shawl held fast. The ring above the door kept its quiet line. The dawn, on its way already, would find each in place and add its light without argument, and the day would pick up the thread where it lay, carrying it forward into the next task the season set. The way a body remembers a tune without ever having learned the notes by name. The frost never fully left that year, not even when the first flowers opened. It lingered in the low ground where the sun could not reach, and in the early hours it returned as a film of silver across the grass. The The woman did not mind it. Frost meant the ground was still holding memory, that the earth had not given up its cool patience to the fast warmth that made men think in straight lines and short seasons. She rose before dawn most mornings, not out of habit now, but because she liked the way the light came on slow. It revealed the world inch by inch, honest about what it touched. The house had taken on the scent of spring, damp wood, turned soil, the faint sweetness of sap drawn back into the trees. She kept her windows open when the air allowed it, and watched the way the curtains breathed. A sparrow had built a nest under the eave. It was not the first to try. Each year a bird tested that spot, and each year she let it. The straw and down fell onto the sill and made a small mess, but she never cleared it until the fledglings had gone. A house that makes room for small lives keeps its own luck in order. The moor beyond the wood had changed its colour again. The heather was grey with promise, and the stones, slick from melted frost, gleamed like the backs of fish. She walked there in the late afternoons, not to gather, not to look for signs, but to stretch her legs and remind herself that the air belonged to more than roofs and rooms. The stones had begun to lean, as they always did by spring. The earth shifts under them, and their shapes alter by inches. She never tried to set them right. They knew their own balance better than she could. Sometimes she would stop at the largest one, the one she had touched so many times before, and rest her hand against it. The surface was smoother now, not from age, but from use. It had taken her touch into itself, along with the winds and the rains. When she stood there, she could hear the soft, low tone that all living things make when they are patient. It was the same note she heard in the river, in the wind across the field, in the faint hum of bees against the hedge. A single sound, carried through different throats. The world had grown noisier elsewhere. The travellers who came through the village spoke of new machines, of foundries that lit the skies red at night, of roads that were no longer mud, but stone and tar. They said people could cross the country in a day now, that words could be sent through wires instead of carried by hand. The woman listened and nodded, but she did not ask for details. A message that travels that fast loses some of its weight before it lands. She preferred the kind of knowing that took its time, the kind that arrived by wind or rumour, or the shape of clouds. The villagers still came to her door, though less often now. They came with smaller worries, an anxious child, a restless cow, a ring that would not stay on its string. She gave them herbs, quiet words, and sometimes only the comfort of being heard. They called her good-natured now, not strange. The years had softened both sides of the conversation. Fear wears out faster than respect if it's not fed. The priest who had once warned his flock against her had gone to a parish closer to the city. The new one was younger, with a gentle voice. He nodded to her when they passed on the road, and never spoke against her from the pulpit. He came to her once after a funeral and asked for tea. They drank it without talk. When he left, he said only, "You keep the old customs well." She had smiled and said, "So does the land." It was true. The land remembered everything. It remembered the fires lit on midsummer nights, the footsteps of those who had danced, the prayers whispered into soil and water. It remembered the ploughs, the ashes, the small offerings left on thresholds when no one was looking. It remembered laughter and grief in equal measure. The earth does not sort what it holds. It keeps all things side by side until they turn into the same quiet hum. She began to notice, as the years moved on, how memory itself changed shape. When she was young, memory had been a sharp thing. Faces, names, the weight of moments that pressed hard into the mind. Now it had softened. The faces remained, but they had no edges. The names came slower, but their meaning grew larger. She remembered people not by how they looked, but by the work they left behind. A chair that still held steady, a patch of ground that yielded well, a habit of kindness that outlived the person who started it. Memory was no longer a ledger. It was a field, and everything in it grew together. The old ones of her youth were gone. Their voices, their sayings, their warnings. They lived now only in her, and in the few younger ones who still listened when she spoke. Sometimes she would tell them how the winters used to sound, how the bells would freeze and ring dull, how the snow packed itself into shapes that hummed when the wind passed over. They would smile politely, the way young people do when they cannot picture a world before their own. She didn't mind. Memory is not a lesson. It is a passing of warmth from one hand to another, and it is enough that the next hand takes it. The world beyond her valley had already begun to forget what it had only just rediscovered. The revival in the cities had lost its fever. The seances had become parlour tricks again. The poets had turned their attention to progress and machines. But in small places, the rhythm stayed. Farmers still buried bread at the edge of their fields for good weather. Women still hung rowan above their doors and tied red thread through the hems of their children's coats. The shape of belief does not vanish. It simply changes its handwriting. On one of her walks to the moor, she found a sprig of heather blooming early, stubborn and small. She picked it and held it between her fingers all the way home, feeling the weight of it against her skin. It smelled faintly of iron and smoke, the same as the moor itself. She set it in a bowl by the window, not to keep it, but to watch it fade. Some things are meant to end in sight. That night, she lit only one candle. The flame stood thin and tall, its light touching the walls without stretching far. She sat near it with her hands folded, listening to the sounds of the house, settling wood, slow wind, the cat shifting on its mat. The fire was low, and the air smelled faintly of ash and wax. The quiet that filled the room was not the kind that waits for something. It was the kind that knows what has already happened and needs no telling. She thought of the faces she had known, the footsteps she had heard pass along her road, the voices that had called her name. She thought of the procession that had once filled her doorway, the shapes that had moved through her home like smoke through still air. She thought of Ellen, whose name was still spoken by a few old lips in the village, and of her grandmother, whose voice she could almost hear when the wind moved the right way. They were not gone, not really. They had simply folded back into the hum that holds all things. When she rose to bank the fire, the cat stirred and blinked at her. Its eyes caught the candlelight and held it for a moment. Two small, steady flames reflecting one larger one. She smiled, reaching down to stroke its head. "You remember too," she said softly, and the cat purred, as if agreement were a sound one could make. Outside, the wind turned and came down from the hills, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and moss. The stars showed in patches between the clouds. Somewhere far off, an owl called once and then was silent. The world had folded into its night rhythm again, steady and unbroken. The woman stood at the door for a while before closing it. The yard was pale with dew, and the rowan tree gleamed faintly in the starlight. She could see her breath, but only just. The frost had not returned, but the air still held its memory. She looked out toward the moor and felt that same pulse she had always felt, the low heartbeat of the land. It was slower now, perhaps because she was slower, but it was there, unchanged, The old ones were in it, all of them, speaking without words, moving without steps. When she finally went back inside, she left the door unlatched. Not wide open, just enough for the air to pass freely. The candle on the table burned steady, its wax running smooth along one side. The flame did not waver. She sat again, the warmth of the room folding around her, and closed her eyes. The sound of the wind through the trees rose softly, not as a warning, not as a song, but as memory itself, an unending thread between what had been and what still was. In that sound, the world told its story the only way it knew how, quietly, completely, without pause. And the woman, listening, understood what the old ones had always known, that nothing truly ends, not the fire, not the voice, not the breath. The form changes, the pattern continues, the land keeps the rest. The candle lowered itself to a small blue point and went out without smoke. The house stayed warm. Outside, the mist began to gather again, soft and unhurried, returning to its own beginning. And somewhere, in the still dark before dawn, the old ones turned in their long sleep and remembered her.